Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. All right, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. The road was quiet and empty as I drove deeper into the countryside. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. I was heading out for a weekend away from the city, somewhere I could be alone, breathe fresh air, and maybe clear my head after the chaos of the past few weeks. I didn't really have a plan beyond that. Just drive, find a spot, and set up camp. The highway peeled away behind me, replaced by a narrow, winding road that cut through dense woods. The trees were thick and close, their branches reaching over the road, forming a green tunnel. I noticed how quickly the sunlight faded as the forest swallowed the light. The air felt cooler here, heavier somehow. I kept my speed slow, watching for deer or anything else that might dart across the road. After about an hour driving, I spotted a small dirt trail branching off the road. It wasn't marked or anything, just a rough path disappearing into the woods. I figured this would be perfect, far enough from the main road that I wouldn't have to deal with noise or other people, but still close enough that I could get out if needed. I turned onto the trail, kicking up dust as I went. The trail was bumpy and full of rocks, making the ride rougher than I expected. My old car groaned and rattled, but I kept going, trusting it to get me where I wanted. The trees grew thicker here, and the light dimmed more quickly. Somewhere off to my left, I could hear the faint sound of running water. I guess it might be a creek or a small river nearby. After about 10 minutes, the trail opened into a clearing. It was just big enough for my car, and I could see the creek running at the edge of the clearing, its water clear and bubbling over rocks. I parked, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The silence was immediate and deep. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the leaves. Just the sound of the creek and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I set up my tent near the water's edge, choosing a flat spot a few feet from the creek, but far enough to avoid any risk if the water rose. As I worked, I noticed how peaceful it felt, like the world had slowed down just for me. I unpacked a few things and made a small fire ring with stones I found nearby. The sun sank lower as I finished setting up camp. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the clearing like dark fingers. I built a small fire, and the warm glow pushed back the cold creeping in the air. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames. It felt good to be away from everything, away from the city's noise and the endless flood of emails and calls. As the light faded, the forest around me changed. The trees lost their colors in the dark, becoming black shapes with edges that seemed to blur and move. The creek's bubbling grew sharper in the quiet night. I felt the cool air settle against my skin and wrap my jacket tighter around me. I went to bed early, crawling into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The fire had died down to embers, and the stars were bright above me. The forest seemed calm, but I knew better than to trust the night's silence completely. Still, I fell asleep quickly, the sound of the creek lulling me. Hours later, I woke suddenly. Something was wrong. The air inside the tent felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing in on me. The sound of the creek was different, less a gentle babble and more a sharp, splashing noise, like the water had risen or was rushing faster. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The clearing was dark, lit only by the pale moonlight breaking through the trees. The fire was out, leaving only the faint glow of embers deep in the ashes. But it wasn't the fire that caught my attention. It was the noise coming from the woods around the clearing. Something was moving out there. At first, I thought it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons. But then I heard the sound of branches snapping close, much closer than the normal distance animals would keep from campfire. The noise wasn't random. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something was creeping through the forest. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. My breath came out in shallow gasps, fogging the thin layer of the tent's mesh. I want to call out, but my throat felt dry and tight. I reached for my flashlight the only weapon I had besides my small pocket knife, which was in my jacket pocket back by the fire pit. The noise stopped. I waited, every nerve on edge. Then a low, heavy footstep sounded just outside the clearing, breaking a twig. My blood ran cold. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't a deer or raccoon. It was big and careful, trying not to make noise, but failing in the process. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent the rest of the way. The cold air rushed in, chilling me instantly. I shone the light into the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees stood still, their trunks like silent guards. No eyes reflected in the light, no movement. Just quiet. I strained to listen. The sound of the creek was back to normal, but something in the forest felt wrong. My skin prickled, and I felt like I was being watched. I scanned the tree line slowly, trying to catch a glimpse of any shape. A shadow moved. My heart jumped. It was a man. He was crouched behind a tree about 20 feet from my tent, half hidden in the darkness. His clothes were dark and dirty, blending into the forest. He didn't move when I shined a light directly at him. Instead, he just stayed low watching. Panic hit me hard. I grabbed the flashlight tighter, my hands shaking. I whispered to myself to stay calm and not make any sudden moves. The man stood slowly, stepping out from behind the tree. His face was grimy, and his eyes looked wild. He didn't say a word, just stared. I could feel his breath in the cold air as he moved closer. I backed into the tent, fumbling for my knife. The man stopped when he was only a few feet away from the tent's entrance. I could see the rough edges of his face, the scars, the dirt. Suddenly, he raised his hand, not in threat, but in a sort of weak wave. His eyes looked tired, desperate even. It was clear he wasn't there to hurt me, at least not right now. He looked like he'd been living in the woods for a long time, rough and broken. I didn't know what to do. I didn't trust him, but I also couldn't ignore the fact that he might be in trouble. After a long moment, I nodded slowly and unzipped the tent fully, stepping out into the cold night. The man looked relieved when I stood up. He didn't speak, but motioned toward the woods. I understood enough. He was lost, stranded here for days or maybe weeks. His clothes were torn, and he smelled like sweat and wet earth. His hands were scratched and bleeding. I reached into my pack and pulled out a bottle of water and some energy bars. I handed them to him without a word. He drank greedily, tearing the wrapper off the bars with his dirty fingers. I could see the gratitude in his eyes. We sat by the fire together, which I reignited carefully. The warmth pushed away the cold and the fear a little. The man didn't talk much, but his presence was somehow grounding. I watched him closely, wondering how he'd ended up here, alone in the forest, surviving like this. As dawn broke, the woods transformed again. The dark shapes became trees, the cold light of early morning casting everything in a soft glow. The man stood up and nodded at me, silently saying thanks. I helped him gather some supplies and guided him back to the dirt trail. The drive back was quiet but full of relief. I dropped him off at the nearest town where he could get help. The fear from the night faded, replaced by a strange sense of connection. In the middle of nowhere, in a dark forest, I'd found a man struggling to survive and helped him find his way home. That night taught me something real. Fear is natural, but sometimes it's what we do in fear that defines us. I left the woods with a clearer head and a heavier heart, but also with hope. Because even in the scariest moments, kindness can be found, and that's what saves us in the end. I rented an old house through Airbnb in a quiet, rural town. The place looked charming in the photos. A 2-story wooden house with peeling white paint, surrounded by tall trees and overgrown grass. The host said it was peaceful and private, perfect for someone looking to get away from the city noise. I wanted a break, so I agreed. When I arrived, the air felt heavy and still, like the kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound. The house creaked and groaned, even though it was daytime. Inside, the floors were wooden and uneven, the walls thin, and the windows old and slightly fogged. The host greeted me politely but seemed a little distracted, and once I started unpacking, She told me to call if I needed anything and left quickly. The first day was uneventful. I explored the yard, walked down a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the woods, and tried to enjoy the quiet. As evening came, I made dinner in the tiny kitchen and settled into the living room. The house was so old that the light bulbs flickered, and the old radiator hissed quietly in the corner. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. That night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something. It was faint but clear enough, a child crying. It wasn't loud, just soft sobs and quiet whimpers. I sat up, listening hard. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere outside the house, maybe the yard or the woods nearby. My heart started beating a little faster. I turned on the bedside lamp and got out of bed to check the window. The moon was just a thin sliver, barely lighting the yard. No movement, no sign of anything. The crying stopped as suddenly as it had started. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal or maybe a stray dog somewhere. I went back to bed, but the sound kept echoing in my mind. Around midnight, I heard it again, quiet sobbing, soft and alone. I stayed awake until it finally stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. When I called the host the next morning to ask about the crying, she was confused. "No kids around here," she said. "The nearest house is miles away. It's mostly old folks living nearby. You sure you weren't dreaming?" I was sure. The crying was real. The second night was worse. I kept the window closed this time and stayed near the door. Around 11 p.m., just as I was drifting off again, I heard a knock at the window. Not the kind of knock you get from a branch in the wind, but a solid, clear tap, like someone trying to get your attention. I froze. I didn't want to look, but curiosity pulled me toward the window. Slowly, I turned on the light next to the bed and pulled back the curtain. Outside, standing just inches from the glass, was a little girl. She was barefoot, wearing a thin white dress that looked dirty and old. Her hair was tangled, and her face was pale. Her eyes were wide and fixed on me, but she didn't say anything. Her lips moved, mouthing words I couldn't hear. I tried to catch what she was saying, but there was only silence. I opened the window slowly, heart pounding. The air outside was cold and smelled of wet earth and leaves. I called out to her, but when I looked again, she was gone. No footprints in the grass, no sound of footsteps retreating. It was like she vanished into thin air. That's when I noticed the wet footprints inside the house. They started at the window and led down the hallway toward my bedroom. They were small, definitely child-sized, and damp, as if someone had stepped through a puddle outside before coming inside. I followed them with my eyes, frozen in disbelief, until they stopped right at the edge of my bed. My skin prickled. I looked around the room, but no one was there. I locked all the doors and windows, turned on every light, and stayed awake all night, listening for any sound. Nothing else happened, but the footprints stayed in my mind. The next morning, I inspected the window and the sill. The glass was cold and had tiny drops of water on the outside. The ground beneath was soft from a recent rain, and there were wet patches that matched the footprints inside. I checked every room for signs of someone entering or hiding, but found nothing. I went to the host again, this time more carefully explaining what happened. She looked at me with the same confused expression. "There's no way a child got in here. The doors have good locks, and I'm the only one with a key. Nobody lives nearby, no kids at all. Maybe you're just stressed." I didn't say anything. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't explain the footprints or the girl at the window. That afternoon, I decided to look around the property to see if anyone else might live close by, or if there was an abandoned place nearby. I walked through the tall grass and overgrown paths around the house. There were old barns and sheds, but all looked empty and falling apart. The trees were thick and the woods stretched deep, but no signs of recent human activity. I did find some old toys scattered near a broken fence. A small doll, cracked and dirty, a worn-out ball. It looked like they had been there for years, forgotten. Maybe a kid had played there long ago. That night, I didn't hear the crying or knocking. The house was still, and I managed to sleep. But the footprints were still on my mind. The last morning before I left, I cleaned the wet footprints from the floor. I checked the window frame one last time, wiping away the drops of water outside. I closed the window tightly and locked it. Before leaving, I took a final walk around the property. I noticed footprints outside the house, small, bare footprints that led toward the woods and stopped suddenly at the tree line. No explanation. The ground was soft and wet, but no sign of anyone returning. I left the house feeling relieved and a little shaken. There was no ghost or magic, no fairy tale to explain what I saw. Just an old house, an empty place, and something real enough to touch and see. Maybe the girl was real. Maybe someone had been nearby, lost or hiding and scared. Or maybe the crying was from long ago, an echo trapped in the walls of the house and the woods around it. But the footprints told me one thing. Someone had been there close enough to leave a trace. And whoever it was, they had walked right up to my bed. I never went back. The town was quiet again, but I couldn't forget the little girl at the window and those wet footprints leading to my bed. The memory stayed with me, real and clear, an unexplainable moment that didn't need ghosts or stories to be scary. Just the idea that someone had come inside without me knowing how or why. I still remember the day I got the old answering machine from my grandmother's estate, like it was yesterday. It was one of those clear spring afternoons when the sunlight felt soft and warm through the windows. I was going through the boxes left behind in her attic, sorting through decades of forgotten things. Old photo albums, letters yellowed with age, clothes that smelled like lavender and mothballs. Among all that dusty stuff, I found the answering machine, nestled inside a cardboard box with Grandma's stuff, written on the side in faded black marker. The machine was heavy, made of beige plastic, scratched and yellowed with time. It looked so out of place in the sleek world I live in. No touchscreen, no Wi-Fi, no blinking lights, just a chunky box with a tape slot and big buttons labeled play, stop, and erase. It still had a coil cord and a rotary dial phone connected to it, tangled and dusty. I didn't really know why, but I felt drawn to it. It was like holding a piece of her life, a way to hear voices from the past. My grandmother had always been a storyteller, and hearing her voice again, even if through a machine, felt comforting. I decided to take it home. At my apartment, I cleaned off the dust carefully, wiped the buttons, and plugged the machine into a power outlet. The familiar whir of the tape starting up gave me a strange mix of excitement and unease. I pressed the play button. There were a few messages at first, old friends leaving holiday greetings, reminders about birthdays, and one or two strange messages I didn't recognize. Then I noticed a single tape with a label in shaky handwriting that read, "Don't play." It was tucked in the side compartment, almost like someone had hidden it away on purpose. Curiosity gnawed at me like a restless bug. I sat on the couch, the machine balanced on my knees. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about obeying the warning, but the voice of doubt was louder. I pressed play. Static hissed for a second. Then I heard a soft voice, whispering so low I had to lean in closer to hear it clearly. It was a woman's voice, tense and desperate, saying my full name. Then the whisper turned into a shaky plea, telling me to stop listening, to turn it off, to forget what I was about to hear. The voice trembled with fear, and it was so real, so raw, it sent a chill down my spine. I paused the tape and looked at the machine's date counter. The recording was dated 10 years before I was born. I pressed play again, my hands trembling slightly. The voice repeated the same plea, begging me to stop, to leave the tape alone. Then the recording ended abruptly, like the tape had been cut. My mind raced. Who could that woman be? Why would someone record a message like that, addressed to me 10 years before I existed? And why was it hidden in my grandmother's things? I spent the next few days trying to piece it together. I went back to the estate, digging through more boxes, searching for clues. I found an old journal, my grandmother's handwriting shaky and faded. Inside, there were notes about a distant relative, a woman who had disappeared mysteriously decades ago. The journal hinted at family secrets, disputes, hidden illnesses, and whispers of someone being watched or followed. The more I read, the more I felt the weight of those old secrets pressing down on me. The tape wasn't a ghost story, and it wasn't supernatural. It was a warning, a cry for help from someone trapped in a very real, very dangerous situation. I realized the woman on the tape wasn't trying to scare me with some fairy tale. She was trying to protect me from something real, something that might still be lurking in the shadows of my family's past. I kept the tape in the machine, but I never played that message again. Instead, I used the clues I found to dig deeper into the family history, connecting the dots piece by piece until I uncovered a story of abuse and betrayal that had been buried for decades. In the end, the tape helped me bring the truth to light, not by supernatural means, but by reminding me to listen closely to the voices of the past and to protect the ones who come after. The house was a large, old thing, built sometime in the 1920s. When we first saw it, I was drawn to the charm that came with age. The tall ceilings, the thick wooden floors, the heavy doors with brass handles that had been polished 100 times over. My husband loved the original fixtures, and so did I. The house had been empty for years, but the previous owners had left behind many things, including an enormous antique mirror hanging in the hallway near the stairs. It was made of dark wood, ornately carved, and it looked like it had come straight from a museum. I was fascinated by it from the start. We moved in during early fall. The air was crisp, and the trees in the yard were already shedding their leaves in bright colors of orange and red. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional sound of a car passing by or a dog barking somewhere down the street. The house felt peaceful, and I thought we had found the perfect place to start fresh. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent my days cleaning, unpacking, and arranging furniture. The mirror was in the hallway near the stairs, reflecting the living room and the entrance hall. It caught the morning light in a way that made the room feel warmer and larger. I'd glance at it sometimes and admire the fine details of the frame. The glass was a little cloudy and had tiny scratches here and there, but that only added to its character. It was about 2 weeks after moving in when I first noticed something odd about the mirror. One afternoon, I was standing in front of it brushing my hair. I caught my reflection blinking just a fraction slower than I did. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make me stop and stare. I blinked again, more slowly this time, watching my reflection. It still didn't quite match me. It felt as if the image was delayed by a moment or two. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining things. Maybe the glass was old. Maybe the surface was uneven. Mirrors from that era were often like that, after all. But over the next few days, the delay became more noticeable. It wasn't just blinking. The reflection's movements lagged behind mine, like it was a video buffering and catching up slowly. When I raised my hand, the reflection's hand would follow a second later. It was strange, and I found myself watching it for longer periods, trying to catch the delay again. I told my husband about it. He laughed it off and said I was overthinking. "It's just a mirror," he said. "Old mirrors sometimes look weird." He didn't seem worried, and I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, after we had finished dinner, I went to the hallway to get my coat. The light was low, just a dim lamp in the corner casting shadows along the walls. As I stood there, I glanced at the mirror. At first, the reflection matched me perfectly, as it always did. Then, slowly, I saw it turn its head away from me. It was a slow movement, deliberate. My reflection looked over its shoulder and then stepped back, away from a mirror, as if it was leaving the frame. I froze. I didn't move a muscle, my eyes locked on the glass. My reflection continued to step backward, disappearing into the dark wood frame. But I stayed perfectly still. I was right there, standing in front of the mirror, but my reflection had moved away. The hallway was silent. No sounds except the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then, the reflection was gone. I blinked and moved my hand, but the glass only showed my real-time image again. It was as if nothing had happened. I tried to convince myself I had been tired or stressed. Maybe it was a trick of the light, but the feeling in my chest told me it was real. Something strange was going on with that mirror. For the next few days, I kept an eye on it, watching closely. Sometimes the reflection lagged. Sometimes it moved independently for a moment or two. I didn't tell my husband anymore because he wouldn't believe me. One night, I decided to investigate. I took a flashlight and approached the mirror slowly. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors settling. The mirror was tall, almost 7 feet, and heavy-looking. The frame was thick and carved with detailed patterns. I ran my hand along the edges, feeling the wood grain beneath my fingers. Then, I noticed something odd at the back. There was a small gap between the mirror and the wall. At first, I thought it was just loose or poorly installed. I pressed my hand against the back of the mirror and felt a hollow space behind it. The wall didn't feel solid. Curious, I tried to see if I could move the mirror. It was heavy, but not fixed to the wall like I expected. After a few moments of pushing and pulling, it gave way slightly, tilting forward. Behind the mirror was a narrow crawl space. The opening was just big enough to squeeze through. The wood lining the opening was old and dusty, and it smelled of stale air and damp earth. I shined my flashlight inside, but the beam disappeared into darkness. I realized this crawl space must have been hidden for a long time, sealed behind the mirror's frame. The old mirror was not just decoration, it was a door. Over the next few days, I researched the house's history. The local library had old maps and blueprints. The crawl space was not on any of the plans, which made me think it was added later or deliberately hidden. I also checked the neighborhood records and found out that the house had been owned by a man in the 1940s who was a recluse. Rumor had it that he kept to himself and was rarely seen. Some neighbors mentioned hearing strange noises from the house, but no one ever checked. The house had changed hands several times since then. I decided to explore the crawl space carefully. I wore old clothes, gloves, and brought a flashlight and my phone. The opening was tight, but I managed to crawl inside. The space was narrow and cold. The air was damp and smelled like mold. I could see old wooden beams, some broken, and dirt walls. It stretched back a few feet before opening into a small chamber. Inside the chamber, I found old, dusty boxes and some rusty tools. Among the clutter, there was a small wooden chair, broken and worn. The floor was covered in dirt and scattered leaves that must have blown in over the years. There was no sign of anything supernatural, just the remains of a forgotten space. But what disturbed me was how the crawl space connected to the mirror. I realized the mirror's reflective surface must have been fixed to a wooden frame that could move, allowing the mirror to act as a hidden door. It explained why the reflection sometimes lagged or moved differently. It wasn't reflecting reality perfectly because the glass and frame could slightly shift or move. The mirror's surface was a thin layer of glass mounted on a moving frame, so when it shifted, the reflection didn't match the real movements immediately. That night, I told my husband what I found. He was surprised, but still skeptical about the strange reflection. To him, it was just an old trick of light and glass. A few nights later, I stayed awake and watched the mirror carefully. At midnight, I noticed the reflection again behaving oddly, moving slower and then stepping aside. But this time I was ready. I grabbed the flashlight and moved quickly to the mirror. I pressed on the edge, and the frame moved again, revealing the crawl space behind it. I crawled in and shone the light into the chamber. I didn't see anything new, but my mind raced with possibilities. Was the crawl space used for storage? A secret hiding place? Or something else? Days passed, and I kept thinking about the crawl space and the mirror. One afternoon, while cleaning the crawl space, I found a small box hidden beneath some old boards. It was locked, but light enough to carry. I took it to the kitchen table and managed to pry it open. Inside were old letters and a faded photograph of a woman standing in front of the house, holding a child's hand. The letters were addressed to someone named Margaret, written in the 1940s, full of worry and hope. The letters told the story of a woman who hid her child in the crawl space to protect them during a dangerous time. The man who owned the house had a violent temper and kept the family trapped inside. The woman used the crawl space as a secret place to hide the child during his angry outbursts. Reading the letters gave me chills. It explained the hidden space, but also the strange reflections. The mirror had been part of that secret. The child must have moved behind the mirror at times, and the reflections were always off because the glass was never meant to just reflect. It was a barrier to a hidden space. We decided to call a professional to check the crawl space and the mirror structure. The contractor confirmed that the mirror's frame was mounted on hinges, designed to open as a secret door. It was a clever but creepy design. We sealed the crawl space door behind the mirror permanently, making sure no one could enter it again. The mirror was reinstalled as a regular piece of decor, with no more strange reflections or lagging movements. Living in that house taught me that sometimes old things hold secrets, but those secrets are not ghosts or fairy tales. They are real, dark histories of people who lived and suffered in silence. The mirror was not haunted, but it held the memory of a hidden, painful past. After that, the house felt different, lighter somehow. The strange reflections stopped. The mirror was just a mirror again, and I never looked behind it again. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky when I stumbled onto the camp. I had been hiking all day through dense woods and rocky trails, pushing myself to cover more ground before nightfall. My legs were sore, and my backpack felt heavier than usual, loaded down with the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove. I was looking forward to setting up somewhere safe and resting. That's when I saw it. A small clearing, no more than a few dozen feet across, tucked between a stand of tall pine trees and a slow-moving creek. In the middle of the clearing was a campfire pit, neatly arranged with a ring of stones and glowing embers still smoldering in the center. The fire was clearly very recent, still warm enough that I could feel the heat when I got close, but no flames left. Beside the fire was a tightly rolled bedroll, laid out flat on the ground, as if someone had just finished lying there and rolled it back up. Nearby, there was a small backpack, unzipped with a few things poking out, some food wrapped in plastic, a water bottle, and a map. The camp looked perfect, not a single twig or leaf out of place. I was surprised to see such an intact setup in the middle of the wilderness, and even more surprised that there was no person in sight. No footprints besides my own leading to the clearing, no other signs of movement. The place felt too clean, too untouched. Curious but cautious, I dropped my pack a few feet away and sat on a fallen log to rest and wait. Maybe whoever made the camp was just nearby, gathering firewood or exploring, and will be back soon. I didn't want to move on and risk missing someone who might need help. I kept my eyes on the trees, watching for any sign of movement. Hours passed. The sun slowly sank behind the horizon, and the woods grew darker. Shadows stretched long and deep, swallowing the edges of the clearing. The sound of the forest changed. Birds quieted, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a cold, prickling sensation along my skin, a mix of unease and alertness. It was one thing to be alone in the forest during the day, but nightfall always made things feel different. Still, no one appeared. I tried calling out a few times, but my voice felt hollow and weak in the vast silence of the woods. No reply came. I considered waiting longer, but knew I couldn't stay here all night. The temperature was dropping fast, and I didn't have the proper gear to camp comfortably without my own setup. I packed my things quietly, leaving the camp exactly as I found it. The warmth of the fire was gone by now. Only cold ash remained. I made my way out of the clearing slowly, eyes scanning the dark woods, ears tuned for any sound. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. Just the wind brushing through the trees and the distant calls of night animals. The next day, I pushed on, feeling the strange weight of that abandoned camp in my mind. I kept thinking about it during the hike, wondering who had been there and why they never returned. It was one of those puzzles that wouldn't let go. Later that afternoon, after a long stretch of hiking, I crossed paths with a park ranger on the trail. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, then I mentioned the camp I had found. The ranger's face changed immediately. His eyes went wide, his mouth tightened, and he looked suddenly pale. He told me the camp had been reported about 3 weeks ago. A hiker had gone missing in that area, and search parties had combed the woods from top to bottom, but when they found the camp, it was completely empty. No fire, no bedroll, no food, nothing. Just an empty clearing. They had no idea what happened to the person or why the camp was gone. I thought about it for a long time after that. How could a camp that looked so fresh and so real disappear completely? How could I find it perfectly set up and warm when the official search found nothing at all? I decided to go back to that spot the next day, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. I took careful notes on my path and marked landmarks, so I could retrace my steps precisely. But when I got there, the clearing was empty. The fire pit was cold and covered in leaves. There was no sign of a bedroll or backpack, no food, no footprints. It was as if the camp had vanished into thin air. I searched around the area, combing through the underbrush and dirt, but found no evidence. No trash, no forgotten gear, no signs of a struggle. Just the empty clearing, surrounded by the same tall pines and quiet creek. The only thing left was a deep feeling of unease, like I had walked into something beyond explanation. Something real but impossible to understand. I never found out what happened to the hiker. I never saw that camp again. And every time I think back to that moment, sitting alone in the quiet woods, waiting for someone who never came, I realize that sometimes the wilderness hides more than just trees and rocks. Sometimes it holds secrets that even time can't erase. It was late September when a group of 5 of us planned a long weekend trip out to a remote part of the national forest in Idaho. The place we picked was about 20 miles off the highway, past a logging road that barely showed up on maps anymore. No cell service, no other people. Just the 5 of us, 2 tents, a campfire, and silence so thick it made your ears ring. We were all in our late 20s, early 30s, people who'd done their fair share of hiking, camping, and being off-grid. Everyone brought their own gear, food, and water filters. We made camp by a creek that wound through a narrow valley between the pine-covered hills. It was one of those places you wouldn't stumble on unless you were looking for it. We set up camp in a small clearing, maybe 60 feet from the water. There was a ring of stones someone had built up as a fire pit long ago. The wood around us was quiet. A few birds, no traffic noise, no planes, just wind in the trees and the creek trickling by. The first night went smooth. We made chili over the fire, drank a few beers we packed in, and settled in around the fire, trading stories and quietly watching the stars come out. By 10, we'd all crawled into our sleeping bags, nothing out of the ordinary. The second night was when it happened. We'd spent the day hiking up a nearby ridge, spent about 6 hours out and back. It wasn't a hard hike, but by the time we got back, everyone was worn out and ready to just sit by the fire and relax. The sun was low when we lit the fire. I remember how it painted the trees gold and how the air smelled like cold dirt and pine needles. It was around dusk, maybe just after 7, when the man showed up. None of us heard him come through the woods. One minute we were talking about how quiet the area was, and the next he was just there, standing a few yards back from the firelight. A tall guy, maybe in his 50s, thin, wearing a dark green canvas jacket, old hiking boots, cargo pants that looked sun-bleached. He had a pack on, nothing fancy. Looked used, maybe even handmade. His hair was gray and short, face lined but clean. He had this way of standing, real still, arms loose at his sides. We all kind of froze when we noticed him. One of us, I think Dan, just raised a hand in a half wave. The guy smiled, that was it. Just a simple, closed-mouth smile like he'd been invited. He walked slowly into the firelight and took a seat on a log someone had dragged over. Didn't say a word, just sat there, hands resting on his knees, looking at each of us, not staring, just watching, listening, like he was part of the group. None of us said anything for a while. Then conversation picked back up in that awkward way it does when a stranger walks into the room and no one knows what to say. We kept things light, talked about trails, food, a movie someone had seen. All the while, the man just sat and listened. He didn't even nod, just smiled. Not constantly, but enough that it never really left his face. No teeth, just a quiet, pleasant, still smile. After about 30 minutes, someone passed him a tin cup of hot cider. He took it, nodded once, sipped. Didn't say thanks. just drank half of it and set it down by his boots. We didn't ask him any questions. No one asked where he was camped, where he was headed, or what his name was. It felt like asking him something might break whatever thin line he was walking between polite and strange. Eventually, we all started getting tired. The fire was burning low, and one by one we stood up, stretched, and walked toward our tents. The man didn't follow. He stayed by the fire, staring into the flames. I was the last to go in. I looked back once and saw him still sitting there. That smile was gone. His face was completely still, lit by the fire and shadows. I fell asleep with my knife tucked next to my sleeping bag, just in case. The woods were too quiet. When I woke up, the sun was just coming over the hill, and the camp felt wrong. I sat up and looked around. Everyone else was already up, standing in the center of camp. I got out of the tent and walked over. All our bags, every single one, had been opened. Not torn, not dumped, just opened. Unzipped slowly and carefully. Items removed and placed back neatly, like someone had been inspecting them one by one. Nothing was missing. Our wallets, phones, GPS units, keys, food, all still there. But everything had been looked through. It wasn't animals. Bears don't unzip side pouches and set your socks aside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't any of us. We were all shaken and confused. No one had heard anything. No footsteps, no zipper noises. Nothing. We looked for tracks. There were boot prints in the soft dirt, some of them larger than ours. A few sets near where the man had sat. Then they wandered off toward the woods, not toward a trail or the creek, just into the trees. After about 50 feet, the print stopped. Literally just stopped. We couldn't find another one, like he'd walked off the trail and then just lifted into the air. We packed up that morning. No one said it, but we all felt the same. Something about that guy hadn't been right. We didn't want to stay another night. As we hiked back out, we passed a ranger station at the edge of the forest. One of us, I think Rachel, mentioned the guy, said we'd had a visitor at our fire and wondered if he was okay being out there without backup. Just a passing comment. The ranger, a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and mirrored sunglasses, looked up from her clipboard. She asked what area we'd been in. We told her. She checked something on her log sheet, then looked back at us. No one else has a permit for that zone, she said. You were the only group supposed to be out there. We all stood there, looking at her, not saying anything. She asked what the guy looked like. We gave her a description, down to the kind of boots he wore. She just nodded, not surprised, not confused, just calm. She didn't say, "I'll look into it," or "You must be mistaken." Just gave us a slow nod and said, "All right, let us know if you remember anything else." That was it. We drove home in silence for a good hour before anyone talked. It's been over a year since that trip. I still think about that man sitting at our fire, watching us, smiling, not saying a single word. I think about how quiet he was, how calm, how he left without a trace, and how he opened our bags just to look through them and put everything back exactly how it was. He didn't take anything. Not food, not money, not gear. I don't know what he was looking for, but I know for sure, whoever he wasn't supposed to be out there, and we'll never know what he wanted. We didn't imagine him. He was real, and someone like that, someone who moves like a shadow and listens like he's learning, doesn't go to places like that by accident. I pulled the car off the narrow road and shut the engine off. My friend lay back in a seat beside me, stretching out like they'd been in the car forever. We'd driven for hours that felt longer than hours, and when we rolled up to the cabin, hidden back a dusty trail, I felt a mix of relief and a little spark that told me this weekend would be different. Remote cabin in the woods, we called it. The last real quiet place. It felt like we had it all to ourselves. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and damp earth. The cabin was simple. Rough pine walls, a small wood stove, a table tucked in one corner, and two twin beds up front. Up a narrow set of stairs, we saw a second door above the stairs. It was plain, made of wood, and had a big padlock on the outside. Someone had locked it. No key taped nearby. I looked at my friend, and they shrugged. No conversation, just quiet. We looked at each other, a shrug back. We would figure out later. That first night, we built a fire in the stove. The wind scratched at the windows, maybe trees rubbing against the glass. It was dark outside, deeper dark. We ate simple food, canned beans, crackers, cheese. Ate with cups of hot cocoa that smelled like vanilla and sugar. The fire threw flickering light. The locked attic door loomed above the stairs. I stared at it, tried to remember what was upstairs. I couldn't. There were no windows, so there was no light creeping through. Only the padlock, heavy and cold. We went to bed early, hoping to sleep in, but I never sleep in cabins. I like to stay half awake. Even with every sound outside, I listen harder. In the night, I woke. It was quiet, no wind. The fire must have died. The house sighed. I heard something. Soft, slow steps. Above us. Footsteps on wood. I sat straight up in bed. My heart picked up. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for another step. There was one, then another, smaller, further away. Then nothing. My skin slid cold. I lay back, blank. I did not say anything. I didn't nudge my friend. I just waited until the next morning. Morning came gray. A dull light washed under the curtains. I got up and pulled on pants and shirt. Cold floorboards under my feet. I walked to the stairs. The attic door stood open. No padlock. No sign it had ever been there. Only the old latch swung open. I swallowed. My friend drifted down the stairs, still rubbing eyes. I pointed at the door. They followed. No words, just a look. We climbed up slowly. The attic was empty. Bare wood floor, bare beams, bare walls. The roof was low. The sky peeked through a crack in the roof, but the window was missing. Wind slipped in. I looked down. Against one wall lay a mattress. Rough, thin, faded. It was not there when we came. It was old, dusty. On the mattress, I saw indentations. Like someone had just got up. Deep lines where shoulders and hips would press. It sagged in the center. I knelt, ran a finger across. No dust, just memory of weight. We stared. I felt cold again. My friend's jaw tightened. They flicked the light switch. A bare bulb snapped on, sputtered. Shadows danced off the walls. The mattress looked even older. I touched it. The springs creaked. Underneath, I saw straw or pine needles. It was filled with something. I dragged the mattress aside, stood on the floor. I looked for a trapdoor, a crawl space. Nothing. I paced. My heart thudded. Something had been here. Recently. Someone had slept here. Slept above us. Footsteps the night before were real. They weren't in my head. I wanted to run down, tell someone, find the road and faster car. But my friend was as quiet as I was. They stood off to the side, arms pressed tight. I felt them trembling. I felt it too. I stepped outside onto a small landing, looked down at the woods. The trees stood tall and still. No movement. The wind had died. We left the attic and closed the door. No padlock. I thought about nailing it shut or putting something heavy in front of it. But the nails were rusted. The door was old. I pushed it closed until the latch clicked. We went back downstairs. The cabin was silent. The stove was cold. We needed fire, needed light. I built a fire quickly. The crackling brought relief. I slid a kettle full of water over to boil. My friend stared at the wood wall above the stove, watched flames crackle, then turned away, walked to the window, looked out at the trees. We ate breakfast in silence. Cold oatmeal, coffee. Cards lay face down on the table. We didn't touch them. The morning light made the cabin feel smaller. The locked door haunted every corner. I thought about going for a walk to clear the head. My friend shook their head. No, we stayed. Later, I heard it again. Faint scraping above us, like someone dragging a boot. I froze. My friend froze. The kettle hissed. The wind rattled wood. I caught my breath. The sound faded. I stared at the ceiling. The old worn planks above me sent a chill through my arms. I thought, they're back. Somewhere. On the attic floor. They're moving something. I lit another fire. I kept my shirt and pants on. I scanned the cabin windows. Nothing moved outside. Only tall trunks in dull light. Night came again. Cold. I slept with a knife by my bed. I pressed my ear against the wood wall. I waited. My friend slept with headphones in. They wore earmuffs. I asked them in the morning why. They said they didn't like noise, or maybe they wanted not to hear. Second night was worse. The footsteps began sooner. Less soft, more purposeful. A lone shuffle, then a thud, then a slow roll above. My heartbeat raced. Something heavy was being moved above us. Plywood or furniture. A chair dragged. Dust fell through the crack under the boards. I pressed the knife handle against my palm. White knuckles. I stared at the ceiling until I thought I would scream. By morning, I felt like I hadn't slept. My eyes bloodshot. My friend was pale. We went back upstairs. The door opened. We sniffed the air. It smelled like dust and something old. The mattress had been moved. Not just pushed. Gone. Not against the wall. Not there at all. Invisible. Empty floor. Someone moved it overnight. Someone took it, carried it away, but there was no sign. No footprints. No scratch marks. Floorboards clean. A few pine needles. I knelt and flicked a stray needle. The fleck came from outside, not from inside memory. The whole attic was empty. We looked at each other. No words. I swallowed. My stomach knotted. The attic was empty, but full in my head. Someone had been using it and left. We packed fast. We left the kettle cold. We rushed the food into paper sacks. We grabbed our bags and brought them downstairs. I looked back at the stairs once. No, twice. The attic door straight and closed again like it was always there. We left the cabin and drove away. We didn't talk. We drank water. We ate food in the car. We listened to radio. We stopped when the engine slowed. When we saw pavement, we both sighed. Back in town, I called the local ranger station. I described the cabin, the lock on the attic, the footsteps, the mattress, the missing mattress. They asked where. I gave directions. They said they would check, but cabins in that area are old and used by hunters or squatters from time to time. They would check the lock and the attic window and such. Weeks later, the ranger left a message. No signs of strangers, no forced entry, no tracks. The mattress was gone. No logs of people there. They checked the attic. No footprints and dust. No marks. The cabin seemed untouched. I thought, maybe someone broke in before we arrived, left the lock, slept up there, then left before morning. Maybe it's someone passing through. Maybe someone used it and left the mattress to sleep, leaving footprints, then cleaned up or carried it further down. Maybe it will be used again. Maybe the cabin is just empty now, 2 stories of wood with old floors and a locked attic. I never returned. My friend doesn't either. We don't talk about it, but I remember. I feel it again when I lie in my bed at night. I listen for footsteps above me. My skin wakes when I hear a shift in my house. I picture that attic, empty but heavy with what happened. And I wonder, did someone else come? Are they back? Or was it only once, like a tiny mark in time? The attic door stays unlocked in my dreams. It was a little after 1:30 a.m. when I got the ping. I've been driving for about 6 hours already, trying to catch whatever post-bar crowd I could before last call hit and the streets went quiet. The pickup was from a bar on the east side of town, a place I've been to plenty of times before. It was one of those local dive spots with a jukebox, sticky floors, and regulars who never seemed to leave. I wasn't expecting much, maybe someone tipsy, maybe someone quiet, but just a normal ride. That's all I thought it would be. When I pulled up, the place was starting to empty out. A couple of people stood outside smoking, laughing too loud, clinging to the last good buzz of the night. I saw her right away. She wasn't with them. She was standing off to the side near the entrance, away from the lights, arms crossed. She was wearing a dark jacket over a red dress. Nothing flashy, but still stood out somehow. Her hair was long and dark, a little messy like she'd been out dancing or walking in the wind. She didn't look drunk. If anything, she looked sober. Sober and tired. She walked straight to the car without hesitation, didn't look around, didn't say anything. She just opened the back door and got in. No greeting, no smile, no small talk. I glanced at her in the rear view. She looked out the window with that same blank stare. I waited a beat, then asked if she had a destination, just to make sure. She spoke low but clear. Gave me an address in a neighborhood about 20 minutes out. I knew it. Small houses, quiet streets, not much going on after dark. I tapped the address in and pulled away from the curb. The whole ride was quiet. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting her to fall asleep or maybe start talking, but she never did. She just stared out the window like she was watching something I couldn't see. Once at a red light, I thought I saw her eyes welling up like she was holding something in, but I didn't say anything. Some people just want to be left alone. I've driven plenty of folks like that. You learn not to ask too many questions. We hit the edge of town and turned onto smaller roads. No streetlights out there, just the dim beam of my headlights cutting through the dark. I remember thinking how weird it was that she picked a spot so far from the bar, especially that late. But again, people do weird things after a few drinks. Maybe she lived out here. Maybe it was a friend's place. I didn't press it. About 5 minutes before we got there, my ears popped. The road dropped a little, and we hit a narrow stretch with woods on both sides. That's when something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could explain, just this crawling sense in my chest, like I'd stepped into a place I wasn't supposed to be. The road was cracked and uneven. I slowed down. No signs, no lights, just trees and blackness. When I finally turned onto the street she gave me, it looked abandoned. Not falling apart, but just empty. No cars in driveways, no porch lights. Every house was dark. I double-checked the address, and yeah, it matched. I pulled up in front of the house, left the engine running, and looked back. The seat was empty. At first, I thought maybe she ducked down or something. I leaned over the console and turned slightly, looking into the back seat. Nothing. I checked the floor. Nothing. The weird part, the seatbelt was still buckled, like someone had just vanished from inside it. I sat there for a second, heart thumping hard, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard anything. I didn't even see movement in the mirror. I got out and checked the back seat just to be sure. Still buckled. Still empty. I turned in a slow circle, looking down the street. No movement. Just trees and shadows. I thought maybe she'd gotten out quietly when I was looking at my phone, maybe ran off, but there was nowhere to run to. No lights. No open doors. No reason to leave like that. I stood there for a while, unsure what the hell to do. I thought about calling someone, cops maybe, but what would I even say? A girl vanished from my back seat. They'd think I was high or sleep deprived. Hell, I wasn't sure I didn't just imagine it myself. Eventually, I got back in the car and drove off. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole way home. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept seeing the back seat in my head. That belt still clipped in, the faint smell of perfume still lingering in the air. The next day, I drove back to bar. I parked across the street and just watched it for a while. A few cars in the lot, but it was quiet. Daylight made it feel smaller, more normal. I kept telling myself, maybe she was just playing some weird prank. Maybe she lived at that house and just bailed out fast. Maybe she had some reason to disappear quietly. I needed it to be something like that. After a while, I went inside. There were a couple of guys playing pool, a bartender cleaning glasses. I recognized him. I'd seen him there before. I sat at the bar and ordered soda. Didn't even feel like drinking. I didn't mean to say anything at first. I just wanted to look around, see if she showed up again. But the bartender saw me staring toward the door and asked if I was waiting on someone. I said no, then added without thinking, I picked someone up from here last night. Young woman, red dress, long hair, said she lived out past the woods. He stopped wiping the glass. I didn't push. I just sipped my soda and waited. Finally, he said, "You sure it was last night?" "Yeah," I said. "About 1:30. She didn't talk much. He looked at me a long time, then said, "We had a girl go missing about a year ago. Bar closed. She called a ride. Her friends left thinking she got it, but she never made it home. Last anyone saw her was out front." She matched that description. That hit me like a gut punch. I asked if they ever found out what happened to her. He just shook his head. No. Cops looked into it. No cameras caught anything. Signal dropped somewhere past the edge of town. That was it. I finished my drink and left. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. The thing is, I know what I saw. I know she got in the car. I remember her face. I remember her voice when she gave the address. I remember the way she sat, arms crossed, eyes out the window, like she didn't want to be seen. And I remember that seatbelt. I can still see it in my head, buckled across an empty seat. I didn't imagine it. I know I didn't. I haven't driven since that night. I told myself I needed a break, but the truth is, I'm scared. Not of ghosts or whatever. That's not what this was. This wasn't some movie thing. This was something real. Someone got in my car, rode with me, and then vanished. I don't know why. I don't know how. I've played every possibility over in my head. Could someone have slipped out without me seeing? Maybe, but not with the belt still buckled. Not that quiet. Could it have been someone playing a trick? Maybe, but who goes that far just to mess with a rideshare driver? Sometimes late at night, I go back to that street on Google Maps. I look at the satellite image, the overhead view of that neighborhood. It's always the same. Blank roofs, empty yards, no signs of life. The house she told me to go to doesn't even have a car in the driveway. Never has, from what I can tell. Just a long sidewalk and a single porch light that doesn't work. I keep telling myself there's a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she needed to disappear. Maybe I helped her in some weird, unknowing way. But the longer I sit with it, the more it eats at me. I don't know who she was. I don't know what happened to her. But I did know she was in my car. And I don't think she ever made it to wherever she was going. Not last night. Not a year ago. I still remember the smell of her perfume. It's the one thing that makes it feel real. Even now, if I catch a scent like that somewhere, my whole body tenses. My heart jumps. And for a second, I think I'm back there again, on that dark road, with the trees pressing in and no one else around. I haven't gone back to that bar. I haven't driven past that house again. But I keep thinking about the ride. About how she looked when she sat down. How she never looked at me. How she never said goodbye. And I wonder over and over if she ever really left that spot out front. If maybe I was just the last in a long line of drivers she flagged down, hoping someone would get her home. Or maybe just take her far enough away. Either way, I still see her sometimes. Not like a ghost or a vision, but in real life. On sidewalks, at bus stops, just for a split second. Someone in a red dress with long dark hair, looking out into the distance like she's waiting for something. And every time, I find myself slowing down just in case. It was the first clear morning after 3 days of off and on rain. I had been waiting in my car, parked at a remote trailhead deep in a national park, miles from any town, let alone people. The plan was to spend a few days hiking solo, sleeping in a bivy sack, and soaking in the quiet that only thick woods and high ridge lines can give. No cell service out here, not for hours in any direction. That was part of the appeal. I needed the silence. Life had been loud lately. I packed light, just a day's food, water, basic emergency gear, and a topo map folded into a Ziploc in my back pocket. I've been hiking solo for years. This wasn't new to me. I'd seen the warnings at the trailhead about recent bear sightings, but I wasn't too worried. I had bear spray, and besides, I didn't plan to go far from the main route. The trail started easy, wide enough for 2 people side by side, with a steady incline underfoot. Trees hung low and wet, their leaves dripping quietly. Maybe 2 hours in, I saw the first cairn, a stack of small rocks, carefully balanced. Nothing strange about that. Cairns are common out here. People build them to mark tricky parts of the trail, or sometimes just out of boredom. But this one wasn't on the trail. It was about 6 feet to the left, just past a fallen log. I only noticed it because it had a little stick on top pointing in a clear direction, off the trail into the thicker woods. At first, I figured someone must have found a better route or maybe a viewpoint. I looked back at the main trail. It kept winding uphill, no end in sight. I figured I'd follow the cairn for a bit, see if there was something worth checking out. Curiosity more than anything. I stepped off the trail, ducked under the log, and found myself pushing through ferns and wet undergrowth. After maybe 30 feet, I saw another cairn. Same size, same little stick, pointing again. That's when I started thinking someone might have made their own shortcut or maybe a bushwhack trail. Not uncommon, but usually discouraged. Still, the pattern was there. Rock pile, stick direction. And I kept following. The woods got thicker as I moved. The ground underfoot turned from packed dirt to a mix of moss and wet leaves. My boots started slipping a little on the uneven terrain. No real path, but the cairns kept showing up. Each one exactly where I expected it. Someone had made sure they were visible just far enough apart to always have the next one in sight. Maybe 10 in total, and I was deep off trail now. I hadn't heard birds in a while. That's what struck me first. The quiet. No wind. No insects. Just the sound of my own boots and my breath. Then I came into the clearing. It wasn't a natural meadow. more like a space where trees had been cleared or had fallen long ago. Dead branches were scattered in piles. The earth was uneven, mounded in places like it had been dug up and left half covered. I stopped at the edge, my foot sinking a little into the soft ground. That's when I heard it, rustling. Not far, not quite behind me, not quite ahead. Off to the right. I turned quick, body tense, eyes scanning for a bear or maybe a deer. But nothing moved. I took a few slow steps into the clearing. My hand was on my bear spray now, safety off. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Just my breath again. Then I saw it. A cell phone. It was zip-tied to the trunk of a tree on the far side of the clearing, about 6 feet off the ground. It looked like one of those older models. Chunky black case, cracked in the corner. The camera was facing outward, right at me. The screen was on, recording. I stood there frozen for a second. The phone didn't move. It just stayed pointed at me like a cold eye. I slowly walked over, boots sinking with each step. My chest felt tight. Something about that phone, just zip-tied like that, felt all wrong. There was no one else around. No sign of camp. No tracks. No trash. Nothing. I got close enough to read the screen. The red dot blinked. Recording. I looked at the battery, still half full. No signal bars, of course. But someone had left it here, still running. Recording who? Me? Then I heard it. Breathing. Not mine. Not the wind. Just behind me. Slow, steady human breathing. I didn't move at first. Just listened. I didn't even blink. I could feel it, someone close enough to touch me, but not touching. I wanted to turn around fast, but I didn't. My brain screamed to hold still. If it was an animal, movement might set it off. If it was a person, I didn't know what was worse. The breathing continued. Shallow, measured, not excited, not panting, just watching me. I finally turned, slow and tight, gripping the bear spray like it was a weapon. Nothing. Nobody there. Just trees, thick and close, maybe 20 feet of visibility in any direction. I turned a full circle. No movement, no sound, but I knew what I'd heard. I hadn't imagined it. I took a few steps backward toward the phone. I don't know why. Maybe I thought the camera would catch something I couldn't see. I looked at the screen again. Still recording. Just being framed now. No movement behind me. I stood there another 10 seconds. Then I grabbed the phone, yanked it from the zip tie. It resisted at first, then snapped free. I hit the stop button and opened the camera roll. There are dozens of videos, all short, 30 seconds, a minute, some just 10 seconds long. I clicked on one at random. Nothing but trees. Still forest. No sound. I scroll back. One dated 2 days ago. It opened with someone walking through undergrowth. The phone must have been in a pocket or mounted on a chest harness. The view was shaky. It ended with the same clearing. The same tree. The camera faced the clearing and then stopped. I clicked another. This one was different. Dark. Maybe shot at night. Wind blowing. A face appeared at the edge of the frame, just for a second. A man's face. Bearded, older. His eyes were wide like he was scared, whispering something I couldn't hear. Then static. The file ended. That's when I realized I was holding someone's last moments. Someone who had walked this same path. Someone who had followed the cairns. I backed away from the tree. I was about to turn and start running when I noticed something else. A shape in the undergrowth, near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a fallen log, but it was too straight, too narrow. I stepped closer, knees bent, eyes scanning. It was a backpack, worn canvas, weathered wet, one strap ripped, half buried under leaves and dirt. I knelt beside it, pulled it free. It was heavy. I opened the top flap. Water bottles, a headlamp, a small, soggy notebook. On the first page was a name, D. Warren, a date, 6 days ago. I flipped pages, notes about the trail, sketches of cairns, then scribbled writing messy and fast. Don't follow the rocks. It's a trap. They move them. They watch. I stopped reading. My mouth went dry. I turned to head back. I was done. Whatever this was, I wasn't staying to find out. I hadn't left a GPS trail. No one knew exactly where I'd gone off trail. If I got turned around, I'd be lost. I pulled out my compass. Got a rough bearing. East, back toward the main trail. I started moving fast. Trees whipped in my arms. The ground was slick, uneven. I checked my back every few steps. No cairns this time. I didn't want help from whoever or whatever built those. I relied on the sun and slope, trying to angle back toward where I thought I'd left the trail. 15 minutes passed, then 20. My shirt was soaked through. My thighs burned from scrambling uphill. Then I saw it, the log I'd stepped over. The first cairn, still sitting just where it had been. Relief hit me hard. I crossed the log back onto the trail. I didn't stop moving, just kept walking fast and steady. No rest, no water break, just miles ahead and a plan to be back at the car before dark. When I finally reached the trailhead, the parking lot was still empty. My car sat there like a waiting friend. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat for a minute, breathing hard. I didn't call the rangers. I thought about it. I still think about it. But what could I tell them? That I found a phone and a bag? That I heard breathing? That someone might be out there watching hikers get lost? I still have the phone. I keep it in a box under my bed. I've watched every video on it. Some of them are blank. Some just static. One shows someone crawling in the dark, whispering a name over and over. Another ends with a scream that cuts off like someone yanked the power cord. None of the videos show who placed the phone. None show who was breathing behind me. And I'll never follow a cairn off trail again. It was close to 1:30 in the morning, and I was somewhere in the middle of Kansas. I've been on the road for almost 11 hours, trying to make it to Colorado before sunrise. I had a small SUV packed full with my bags, snacks, water bottles, and one of those cheap memory foam pillows shoved between the seat and the door. The kind of road trip that wasn't for fun, just relocation. I had left behind my apartment and most of what I owned. What I had now was what fit in my car. And I was running on caffeine, fast food, and whatever was left of my nerves. I had passed 3 exits without stopping. Each one had a gas station or a 24-hour fast food place, but none felt right. You know that gut feeling you get sometimes? Like not outright fear, but a whisper that tells you, keep going. So I kept going. But eventually, nature called, and it wasn't the kind I could ignore. That's when I saw the sign for a rest stop. Blue and white, slightly faded, but promising restrooms and vending machines. The kind built in the 80s and never really updated. I remember the big parking lot first, almost entirely empty except for a few trucks parked in the far lanes. Their engines were off, no lights, just hulking shapes in the dark. The building itself was a squat, concrete block with a small peaked roof. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above the door, one flickering slightly. And farther down the lot, under a broken overhead lamp, sat a white cargo van. It wasn't close, maybe 50 or 60 yards away, parked by itself at an angle. One of those plain vans with no windows on the sides, the kind you might see a plumber or contractor driving during the day. At night, though, in a near-empty rest stop, it felt different, like it didn't belong. I pulled my car into a space closer to the main building, close to the entrance. I left the engine running at first. The restrooms were labeled with those old steel signs bolted into the wall. I hesitated, looked around. The lot was still, no wind, the buzzing light the only sound. I shut off the engine but kept my keys in my hand. My phone was in my back pocket. I didn't bring my bag, just the keys and the phone. I walked fast. The bathroom smelled of bleach and stale air. Cold too. The air conditioning was cranked too high. It echoed. Every step I took loud against the tiles. There was no one inside. I used the stall quickly, not even washing my hands, just a quick pump of sanitizer from the bottle I carried. I wanted to be back in my car. I wanted to lock the doors and be gone. I opened the heavy restroom door with my shoulder, stepped out into the dim yellow light, and froze. The Fenster was open. Not fully, just slightly ajar. Maybe a foot, like someone had just stepped out or was waiting inside. I hadn't heard it slide open. I hadn't seen anyone approach. But now it was open, and a man's voice came from the dark. "Hey," he called out. I didn't move. I didn't answer. "I think you dropped something." It was calm, not loud, not threatening, just matter of fact, like he was trying to help. But I hadn't dropped anything. I knew that. I hadn't been carrying anything to drop. The keys were in my hand. The phone was in my pocket. My heart was thudding hard, sharp and quick. My body was telling me to move. I turned and walked as fast as I could without breaking into a run. I didn't want to look scared, but I was. Every step felt like it was echoing across the lot. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to give him a reason to chase me. I reached my car and hit the unlock button just before grabbing the handle. The door clicked and I was inside. Engine started, doors locked before I even let out a breath. My headlights lit up the concrete in front of me. I put the car in reverse, looked behind. The van was still there. Door open, no one in sight. I shifted into drive and pulled out of the lot. My hands were shaking. I told myself not to speed. Just act normal. Keep going. Get back on the highway. Once I was going 75 with traffic around me, I'd feel better. Safe. The ramp back onto the highway was a gentle loop, bending out of the rest stop and rejoining the freeway. I took it fast, the tires bumping over the edge of the road a little. And just as I was merging onto the right lane, headlights clicked on behind me. Bright, square headlights. High up off the ground, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the white cargo van pulling out onto the on-ramp. It had been parked for who knows how long, and now it was moving. I told myself not to panic. Maybe he just happened to be leaving too. Maybe he was just someone trying to get back on the road. But he didn't merge into the left lane. He stayed behind me. No passing, no changing lanes. Mile after mile, he stayed back there. Never too close, never too far, just following. I tapped the brakes lightly once, just to see what would happen. He slowed too, matched my speed perfectly. I checked the time. It had been nearly 20 minutes since I left the rest stop. No exits, no other cars, just me and him. I tried calling 911, but I had no signal, not even one bar. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and looked ahead. There was a green sign coming up, a junction. Two options. The highway kept going west, but there was also a state road branching off to the south. It wasn't labeled with any big towns, just a number. I had about 10 seconds to decide. Stay on a main road or take the turn and see if he followed. At the last second, I slowed and flicked my blinker. My stomach was in knots. The road curved off sharply, disappearing into the dark with no streetlights, just trees and open fields. I turned. My headlights lit up the small green mile markers and the reflectors lining the shoulder. The road was narrow, no other vehicles. I drove for maybe half a mile before checking the mirror again. The van didn't follow. I felt a breath leave my chest in a heavy gust. He kept going straight, or maybe he realized I'd made him. Maybe he had no reason to follow anymore. I didn't care. I drove for another 10 minutes just to be sure. Then I found a small town on my GPS. I headed there, checked into a 24-hour chain motel using a debit card under a different name I kept for travel. Something I'd set up long before, in case I ever needed to disappear for a while. That night, I parked under the camera in front of the office, slept with a knife in my hand. I didn't sleep much. My eyes kept going back to the sliver of parking lot I could see through the curtains. The next morning, I called the local sheriff's office, told them what had happened, gave them the mile marker, the rest stop, everything I could remember. They took the report, but didn't seem surprised. The officer said they'd send a unit to check the area, but he also said there's a lot of people who hang around rest stops at night. Some worse than others. Best not to stop unless you have to. I finished the drive to Colorado later that day. Got in just before sundown. My hands didn't stop shaking for most of the afternoon. For a while, every white van I saw made my stomach turn. Even now, if I pass a rest stop at night, I keep going. Even if I need gas. Even if I'm tired. I wait for a lit exit with a gas station and a store and people. And every time I get back in my car, I lock the doors immediately. I check the mirrors. I look around before I leave the lot. Because I know what I saw. I know what almost happened. And I know how close I came to taking the wrong road. The one he took. The one with no lights and no cameras and no help for miles. That night didn't end in screams or sirens. No crime was officially committed. But I still count myself lucky. Because I trusted that whisper in my gut. I didn't answer him. I didn't stop. I didn't let curiosity win. I drove away, and I'm here to tell the story. I was hiking alone in a dense California forest once. It started as a plan for me and a friend to hike together, but she got a migraine halfway through the trail and decided to take a shortcut back to our campsite. She said she could make it faster on her own and just wait for me when I got back. I didn't want to slow her down, so I told her I'd finish the whole trail by myself. I thought it would be fine, just me, the forest, and the trail ahead. The trail had been peaceful in the morning. The air was cool, but starting to warm up with the sun climbing higher. The trees around me were thick, tall pines with their needles rustling gently in the breeze. The forest floor was soft underfoot, covered with layers of dry leaves, pine cones, and twigs that snapped quietly as I walked. The path was narrow but clear, winding down a steep hill through the dense woods. I was descending, careful not to slip on loose stones and exposed roots. At first, everything seemed normal. Birds chirped here and there. A squirrel darted up a tree. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. But as I went deeper into the woods, the trail got quieter. The birds stopped singing. The wind fell away, and the forest felt heavier, like the silence itself was watching me. I could feel my heart starting to beat a little faster, but I told myself to calm down. I was used to hiking alone sometimes. I kept moving forward. Then I heard it, a scream, a truly blood-curdling scream that cut through the stillness like a knife. It was sharp and loud, full of pain and terror. At first, I froze. My mind raced. Was it a person? Someone hurt or attacked? The scream sounded so real, so close, it sent a chill through me. But the woods were empty. There was no way anyone was nearby. I scanned the thick trees, expecting to see something, anything, but all I saw was the dense forest and shadows. Then the screams came again, longer and louder this time. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a person. It was something else. The sound had a wild, animal quality, like a scream mixed with growls. It hit me suddenly. It had to be a mountain lion. I remembered reading about how mountain lions can scream in a way that sounds almost human, especially when they're angry or hunting. That realization did not help. If anything, it made things worse. I was alone, far from the campsite. My friend was already gone, and now, somewhere in those trees, a mountain lion was making those horrible screams, probably stalking its prey. I tried to decide what to do. Should I be loud and try to scare it off? Or should I stay quiet, hoping it wouldn't notice me? I had no idea what the right choice was. The screams came again, a little farther off now, but still close enough to make my blood run cold. My heart was pounding so loud, I thought it might burst. I stopped moving and stood completely still. I tried to listen carefully to figure out where the sound was coming from. The scream seemed to come from the left side of the trail, deeper into the woods, near a thicket of bushes and fallen logs. I held my breath, waiting, hoping whatever it was would go away. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe more. The silence returned slowly. The forest seemed to breathe again. I started to back away, moving slowly and quietly, but deliberately away from the direction of the screams. My feet barely made a sound on the dry leaves. I didn't dare look behind me, afraid that if I did, I might see something watching, waiting in the shadows. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. My mind was racing with questions. Was the lion still following me? Had it already attacked someone else? Was I going to make it back safely? I couldn't stop thinking about the scream, how real and desperate it sounded. It was the kind of sound you never forget, the kind of sound that makes you wonder how close death really is. I kept hiking down the trail, moving faster but still careful not to slip. The hill got steeper and the trees thinner as I approached the bottom, where the campsite was supposed to be. The sun was lower now, starting to set behind the hills. Shadows stretched long and deep across the forest floor. I tried to calm my breathing to focus on the trail ahead, but the fear was still there, thick and heavy in my chest. Finally, I saw the edge of the forest opening up. The trail ended near a small clearing where I could see the tents of other campers, including ours. Relief washed over me in waves. I was safe. I was out of the woods. I walked the last few steps and saw my friend sitting by our campsite, looking pale but better. I was sure I looked like a ghost myself, white-faced and shaken. That night, as I lay in my tent, I kept hearing the echo of those screams in my mind. I wondered if anyone else had heard them, if they knew what had been out there in the woods. I thought about what could have happened if I hadn't listened carefully, or if the mountain lion had been closer. The thought made my skin crawl. I realized then how small and vulnerable I really was in that wild forest. I never forgot that hike. The way the forest can go from calm to terrifying in seconds. The way nature's sounds can turn into warnings or worse. It's a feeling I hope never to experience again, but one I'll always remember. The raw fear of being alone and hunted in the woods. Another time, I was at a music festival. It was one of those big outdoor events where people camp right next to each other in a giant field packed with tents. The ground was soft and a little muddy from rain earlier in the week. There were hundreds of people everywhere, all buzzing with music and excitement. The night before, the camp was full of noise, laughter, shouting, music blasting, and the smell of campfires and grills. My friend and I had set up our small tent close to the back of the field. It wasn't much, just a basic 2-person tent with a thin sleeping pad inside. We were tired from the day's activities and fell asleep early, wrapped in sleeping bags, listening to the distant music. The sounds of the festival slowly faded as most people settled down for the night. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. It was still dark outside, just before dawn, but I was startled awake by the sound of a truck engine. It was loud and rough, tearing through the quiet night. My heart jumped. At first, I thought maybe it was a delivery truck or something driving on a nearby road. But then I realized the sound was moving closer, right toward our campsite. I sat up in my sleeping bag, squinting through the tent's thin fabric. Outside, I could see the red glow of taillights moving slowly, almost creeping between the rows of tents. The truck was driving directly through the field where everyone was sleeping. It was crazy and dangerous, and I didn't understand why anyone would do that. Then I saw the headlights cut on for a moment, and my stomach dropped. The truck was headed straight for our tent. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and grabbed my friend's arm. She was still asleep, barely waking up, groggy and confused. I pulled her close and quickly rolled her on top of me as the truck reached our tent. The tires crushed the fabric, tearing the tent in half where she had been sleeping just moments before. The ground shook under the truck's weight. It all happened so fast. The truck's engine roared as it drove through, stopping just a few feet beyond us. People started yelling and running toward the driver, but I didn't look back. I held my friend tight, making sure she was okay. She was shaken, but not hurt. After the truck passed, the campsite was filled with chaos. People shouting, tents ripped apart, some campers crying or checking their belongings. It felt like a nightmare. How can anyone be so reckless? Driving a truck through a crowded campsite, risking lives and ruining people's gear. It was selfish and dangerous. The organizers eventually got the driver to leave, and the police showed up later to take a report. Some people said it was a prank gone wrong or someone drunk making bad decisions. But for me and my friend, the memory of waking up to a truck crashing through our tent stayed with us long after the festival ended. That morning, I helped my friend pack up what was left of our camp. We didn't say much. We just moved quietly through the wreckage, grateful we were both safe. The whole experience was a harsh reminder that danger can come from the wild woods or even from the careless hands of other people. In those moments, fear isn't something you can control. It just takes over, and all you can do is hold on and hope to get through it. We started the trip with good spirits. It was early September, and the mornings were cold but clear. The plan was simple: 5 days, 150 miles down the Yukon River. We were starting at the south end of Lake LaBerge. It's a massive stretch of water, and we had planned carefully. The lake has a reputation. If you capsize, the cold water takes you fast, maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia sets in. The advice is always the same: stay close to shore. No more than 100 yards. That was our rule too. The first morning, we were slow getting going. Loading the canoe took longer than expected. We had packed everything carefully: tent, dry bags, food barrels, a bear canister, extra clothes, and dry sacks. Emergency bivy sacks, a saw rope, the usual gear. The sky was overcast, and the wind was already kicking up. It wasn't too bad at first, just annoying. The water had some chop, but nothing dangerous. By midday, the wind picked up hard. It wasn't just a headwind, it came at us sideways, sometimes slanting across the water and catching the bow. It forced us to paddle more on one side than the other. It was exhausting. Even hugging the shore, waves would slap the side of the canoe hard enough to splash cold water into our laps. We wore rain gear, but it didn't matter. That kind of wind drives the cold deep. My gloves were soaked by the afternoon, and my hands were stiff and clumsy. We made almost no progress. By the end of the first day, we hadn't gone half the distance we had planned. We barely found a decent place to camp. The shoreline in that stretch of Lake LaBerge isn't always welcoming. It's not all soft beaches and driftwood. A lot of it is sharp, rocky ledges with dense bush behind them. We finally pulled off at a sloped gravel spit with enough flat ground to pitch the tent. We were too tired to talk much. Just pitched camp, boiled water, ate fast, and crawled into the sleeping bag, still damp and shivering. The second morning started the same. Wind, strong and steady. The lake looked like crumpled metal, reflecting gray clouds. It was noisy too, the kind of constant roar that gets inside your head. We kept paddling anyway. Every minute felt like work. My arms were sore. My lower back ached from bracing and balancing. Around noon, something changed. It was sudden, like a switch flipping. The wind just stopped, like it had never been there. The water smoothed out, went totally flat. We drifted for a few minutes without saying a word, just looking at it. It was like glass, like you could walk on it. The whole lake became a mirror of the sky above. Endless silver with streaks of faint blue and pale gray clouds. I remember the sound of the paddle dipping into the water. So clear and crisp it felt like breaking silence in a church. We figured this was our shot. We were way behind schedule. We'd planned to stay near shore the whole time, but the shoreline curved in long peninsulas, and we thought maybe we could cut across. Save an hour or two. On the map, it looked like a straight shot between 2 points of land, maybe a mile across. It didn't seem like much. With no wind and flat water, it felt safe. So we went for it. About halfway across, we were probably half a mile from either shore. Still glassy, still calm, but there was this feeling, hard to explain. Not dread, not yet, but I started checking the sky more often. The light had shifted a little. It had gone from silver and pale blue to something more gray, more flat. The clouds started thickening. No wind, but the kind of stillness that doesn't feel right. Like the air itself is waiting. Then I saw it, just a ripple on the far end of the lake. You get to recognize those signs. A ripple where there shouldn't be one. It started small, but it grew fast. The water darkened under it. The sky followed. A cold gust hit my face. It smelled sharp, like rain and rock and something metallic. Then another gust. And just like that, the lake stopped being a mirror. Waves came fast. Not huge at first, but they built quickly. The wind didn't ease in. It punched us. The canoe started rocking hard, tipping a little more with each passing wave. The sky darkened so fast, it looked like someone turned the sun off. We saw flashes in the clouds, lightning, thin and high at first, but getting closer. We didn't talk. We didn't have to. We both turned the canoe into the waves. If we tried to keep going sideways across them, we'd flip for sure. The waves were growing 2 feet, then more. They weren't regular either. Some came faster, some slammed harder. It felt chaotic. You couldn't fall into a rhythm. We rode hard, harder than I've ever rode in my life. We weren't trying to move forward anymore. We were just trying not to drift farther into the middle of that massive lake. We had no anchor, nothing to hold us. So we paddled like hell just to keep our position. Each time we slowed down, even a little, the wind shoved us backward. Lightning cracked again, closer this time. I couldn't even tell how far. It echoed off the water. Thunder came almost right after. That's when I really felt it. That crawling, primal feeling that you might die here. Not because of anything dramatic. Not because of a bear or a fall or a freak accident. Just cold water and bad timing. Dying here would be slow and quiet. Your canoe flips, you go under, your lungs seize from the shock, your limbs stop working, and that's it. No one would ever find you. We kept turning the bow into the waves, bracing hard. I remember my hands burning, shoulders screaming. The paddle felt heavier with every stroke. A few times, water poured over the side. Not a little splash, a full dump into the bottom of the boat. Our boots were soaked. Our packs were getting wet despite the dry bags. I could feel the cold water pooling around my feet. My mind kept racing, calculating how far it was to shore, how long we could keep paddling, how close the lightning was. But mostly it was just a blur. Focus, paddle, brace, breathe. Over and over. The same motion, the same fear. After maybe 45 minutes, though it felt like hours, the wind started to ease. Not stop, but weaken enough that we could actually make headway. We still had to fight it, but now we were gaining a few feet at a time. The shore was maybe a quarter-mile away by then. It looked impossibly far, but we were moving toward it, finally. The waves didn't stop. They rolled under us, cold and relentless. But they weren't as tall anymore. Not crashing over the sides, just slapping, pushing. We paddled in silence. Both of us soaked, both of us exhausted. When we hit the shore, we didn't celebrate. We just dragged the canoe halfway up the rocks and collapsed next to it. My hands were trembling. My legs barely held me up when I stood. I looked back out at the lake and saw the storm still moving, racing north, the tail end breaking up over the far side. We didn't have time or energy to build a proper shelter. We found a narrow spot behind a rocky outcrop with a bit of tree cover. Threw up a tarp as best we could, tied it low between some driftwood and a bent tree. It wasn't elegant. It barely covered both of us. We crawled underneath and just sat there for a long time, wrapped in our sleeping bags, too stunned to talk. Later, we got a small fire going with what drywood we could scavenge. Not much, but enough to boil water and warm our hands. We didn't unpack much that night. Just enough food to eat something hot, dehydrated chili, and a bit of trail mix. I kept shaking for a long time. Not from cold, just from nerves. That kind of fear doesn't go away fast. It sticks to your bones. The rest of the trip wasn't easy, but nothing came close to that second day on Lake LaBerge. We kept ashore like our lives depended on it because they did. The wind came and went, the river narrowed again, and we made better time. But we both knew we had come close. Too close. People hear about storms and think of drama, of crashing thunder and howling wind. But out there, in the middle of a flat lake, with nothing between you and the cold black water, the real fear is quieter. It's the moment you realize you don't have control anymore. The moment you know that nature doesn't care about your schedule, or your plan, or your gear. We made out. We finished the trip, pulled into our last stop 5 days later, soaked and sore and quiet. There wasn't any big moment of relief or triumph. Just the feeling of touching solid ground and knowing you don't have to fight anymore. That 45 minutes on Lake LaBerge never left me. It plays in the back of my mind every time I see still water or feel a gust of wind roll across a lake. The silence before the storm, the waves building under the boat, the crack of lightning. I can still feel all of it. I've had worse moments, maybe. I've had weirder and stranger stories. But I've never had a moment where I was more certain I might not make it back. That lake doesn't forgive mistakes. We were lucky. That's all it was. Just luck and not letting go of the paddle. The rain didn't stop. It was relentless, a steady pounding that soaked everything around us. We had been camping in southern Ohio for 3 days, a family trip I had hoped would be a peaceful escape for my wife, who was pregnant at the time, and our 2 young daughters. We'd chosen a quiet spot near a small creek, a place surrounded by towering oak and maple trees, thinking it would be perfect for the kids to explore and for us to unwind. But the weather had other plans. The first day was fine, even pleasant. The girls ran around, chasing each other and collecting leaves. My wife and I took turns setting up the tent and making sure we had enough food and supplies. But by the afternoon, the sky darkened. Heavy clouds rolled in, and before long, rain started to fall. Not just a sprinkle, but a constant, soaking rain that didn't let up for 2 days straight. Our clothes stayed wet, our gear was damp, and the ground around the campsite turned into thick mud. Every step was a struggle. We tried to keep the girls entertained inside the tent. They colored with crayons, played card games, and listened to stories on my phone. My wife was tough, but I could see the worry in her eyes about being stuck in such miserable conditions. Being pregnant made everything harder. She was uncomfortable, cold, and constantly wet. I kept checking on her, wrapping her in layers and trying to keep her spirits up. I was worried too, but I didn't want to show it. We had to make the best of it. The Jeep was parked just a few feet from the tent, close enough for me to grab supplies quickly, but far enough away to not block the tent's opening. The ground beneath it was soft, but I hadn't thought much of it. The trees around us were massive, old oaks with roots that dug deep into the earth. I figured they were sturdy enough to withstand a little rain. But on the third night, everything changed. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a strange noise, something heavy moving through the silence. The rain was still falling hard, but now there was an additional sound, a deep cracking, like the snapping of giant branches or timber. My heart started racing before I even opened my eyes. Then there was a sudden, thunderous crash, like the world was breaking apart. The massive oak tree, soaked by days of nonstop rain, had finally given up. The soil around its roots was so saturated it couldn't hold anymore, and the tree was uprooted, crashing down with incredible force. It hit my Jeep first, the metal groaning and crumpling under the weight, then rolled onto our tent. The noise was deafening, branches smashing through the fabric and the tent poles bending and breaking. The tent collapsed instantly, pinning us underneath. My wife's screams cut through the storm as the heavy trunk crushed part of the tent down onto us. I felt a sharp pain in my side where the tree had hit me. I couldn't move easily, but adrenaline kicked in. I had to get us out. The tent was a mess, sticks and leaves everywhere, and the rain poured down harder than ever, soaking us even more. My wife was trapped underneath one side, her pregnant belly pressed down by the heavy branches. My daughters were scared, crying quietly, pinned down, but thankfully not seriously hurt. The Jeep was wrecked, crushed beneath the massive tree. I felt sick seeing it like that, knowing how close we had come to something much worse. I forced myself to focus. I checked my wife first. She was breathing, groaning, but conscious. I crawled over and gently moved the smaller branches off her. It wasn't easy, and the weight of the big branches made it impossible to lift her completely. Then I turned to my daughters. They were huddled together, tears running down their muddy faces. I pulled the broken tent fabric off them, making room to get them out one by one. Pain shot through my ribs, but I ignored it. I kept moving, tearing at the tent poles and branches, desperate to free my family. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before we were all out, sitting in the muddy ground, soaked and shivering. The storm was still raging around us. I looked around, the reality sinking in. The tree was huge. It had crushed the Jeep flat and landed right on top of us. The tent was ruined. We were in the middle of a soaked forest, with no shelter and little way to call for help. The nearest road was a good mile away, and the rain showed no sign of stopping. I wrapped my arms around my wife, checking her carefully. She was in shock, but alive. The girls were scared, but unharmed except for some bruises and scratches. I checked myself next. My ribs hurt badly, and my ankle felt twisted, but we had survived. The rest of the night was a blur. I did my best to keep the girls calm, trying to shield my wife from the cold and wet as much as possible. I stayed alert, listening for any signs of rescue or help. The storm kept howling, but somehow we made it through until dawn. When the rain finally slowed and the sky started to lighten, I managed to drag myself and the family to the nearby road. We flagged down a passing car, and soon after, an ambulance was on its way. The medics were surprised we had survived such a disaster with only a few broken bones and exhaustion. In the hospital, the doctors told us it was a miracle. The tree could have killed us all instantly. They said the odds of walking away were slim, especially with my wife's condition. She later gave birth to a healthy baby boy, a little miracle after the terrifying night. Looking back, I can't describe how lucky we were. The storm, the tree, the Jeep, it all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But we stuck together, fought through the pain and fear, and survived. Now, whenever I think about that trip, I'm filled with a mix of gratitude and awe. We went into the woods hoping for a simple family adventure, but what we got was a test of everything: strength, love, and survival. That oak tree may have tried to crush us, but it couldn't break us. We came out the other side, battered and bruised, but alive. And that's what matters most. I worked in Yellowstone during the summers of 2011 and then again from spring to fall in 2013. Spending that much time in the park, I got used to hearing stories about the wildlife, especially the bears. Bears were a constant presence in the back of my mind, even when I wasn't working. I knew they were wild and dangerous, and that any mistake could lead to serious trouble. It was just part of the job, part of living in that environment. In the summer of 2013, my girlfriend and I decided to go camping just outside Cook City. I chose the spot because it was close to where I had heard a terrible story a couple of years before. Back in 2011, I'd heard about a bear attack that happened at the campground we planned to stay at. 3 people had been attacked, and one of them had died. The story stuck with me. It was real, not some campfire tale. Before we went to bed that night, I asked the waiter at a small restaurant in Cook City if the story was true. He confirmed it. The attack had happened 3 years earlier, right there at that campground. It gave me a chill, but I pushed it down. I figured we were prepared. We had all the gear we needed. Bear spray was right by my girlfriend's side of the tent, and I kept my softball bat next to me. I wanted to feel ready, like if something came near, we could protect ourselves or at least scare it off. But even with that, camping in grizzly territory is nerve-wracking. You never feel completely safe. The night settled in with a calm that felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The forest around us was dark, but the sky was clear, and the full moon hung bright above, casting a pale glow through the trees and onto the ground. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Somewhere around the middle of the night, I woke up with the overwhelming urge to pee. I was lying there, staring into the dark inside the tent, trying to work up the courage to unzip the door and step out into the cold night air. My heart was already pounding. The forest noises, the rustle of the leaves, the distant call of an owl seemed louder than usual. Then I heard it, a heavy, steady sound coming from the small stream that ran not far from our tent. It wasn't the usual trickle of water. It was something large moving through it, the deep, slow clomp of a massive animal crossing the water. My heart slammed against my ribs, adrenaline hitting me like a shockwave. Every nerve in my body jumped awake. I was frozen, scared to move, but too wired to stay still. The sound got closer. I could hear the splash of water and heavy footsteps moving toward our campsite. My breath caught. Slowly, I reached over my girlfriend, who had started to stir, probably waking up from the sound too. I had to grab the bear spray beside her without waking her completely or causing panic. As my hand brushed over her arm, she stirred fully awake, eyes wide in the moonlight. I pressed my hand gently but firmly over her mouth, whispering for her to stay silent. There was no time for words. The pounding steps continued, heavy and uneven. Mixed in with the steps was something strange, a thud like something hard hitting the ground again and again. We both stayed still, barely breathing, straining to hear what was going on just outside our tent. After what felt like an eternity, we slowly worked up the courage to unzip the tent's fly, peeling it back just enough to look out into the moonlight. What we saw was completely unexpected. Right in our campsite, standing quietly near the edge of our gear, were 2 elk, a massive bull and a doe. The bull elk was doing something strange. It was picking up a rock with its huge antlers and dropping it over and over onto the ground. The thud we'd been hearing was the rock hitting the earth. It wasn't aggressive, but it was definitely strange behavior, almost like it was playing or marking the territory. The doe stood beside him, calm and still, watching the scene as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Their eyes reflected in the moonlight, bright and alert, but they made no move to come closer to the tent or scare us away. It was one of the coolest and strangest things I'd ever seen in the wild. But at the same time, it was terrifying. I was a chicken, honestly. Even knowing that it wasn't a bear, having a huge bull elk messing around in your campsite in the middle of the night, right where you're sleeping, is enough to give anyone the creeps, especially in grizzly country where anything else could be lurking nearby. We stayed completely still and quiet until the elk wandered away, the bull dropping the rock one last time before lumbering off into the trees with the doe following. The forest noises slowly returned, and the adrenaline started to fade enough for me to finally get up and use the bathroom, still gripping the softball bat tightly. The rest of the night was restless. Every little noise made me jump. My mind kept going back to the bear attack story and all the close calls I'd heard about while working in Yellowstone. Even though nothing bad happened, the night stayed heavy in my memory. Years before that trip, I had another close call with a bear camping above Yosemite when I was about 10. My aunt, cousin, and I were camping, and during the night, a black bear shattered the back passenger window of my aunt's car to get inside. The crash of the glass woke us up, and we watched, frozen, as the bear rummaged through the car, grabbing anything it could find. It was terrifying to be that close to a bear and see how quickly they could break into something and cause chaos. My aunt and cousin stayed safe, but that night left a permanent mark on how I think about camping in bear country. That experience, combined with the one at Cook City, taught me that being prepared doesn't mean you're ever completely safe out there. Nature is wild and unpredictable. No matter how much you try to control it or plan for it, it's always going to surprise you. Those nights weren't about ghost stories or made-up monsters. They were about real life, real dangers, and real moments where I felt small and vulnerable. I still camp, but I always carry my bear spray and something to defend myself with. And I keep my senses sharp, because no matter how many years pass, the memory of that elk dropping rocks right outside our tent and the sound of a large animal crossing the stream in the dead of night stays with me. It reminds me that out there in the wild, you never know what's watching, waiting, or wandering through your camp. And that's the kind of fear that sticks with you, not from something made up, but from something very real. I was camping in Savo National Park in southern Kenya. It was a trip I've been looking forward to for months, the kind of wild, raw experience you read about, but never really expect to live through. The day had been long and hot, with the sun baking the dusty earth as we drove deep into the park. The landscape stretched out wide and empty, full of tall yellow grass, scattered acacia trees, and distant hills that shimmered in the heat. My guide and tracker, a man named Kamau, knew every inch of the place like it was his own backyard. I trusted him completely. He was calm and confident, and his knowledge of the animals was incredible. We set up camp in a small clearing not far from a dry riverbed. The air was thick with the smell of dust, dry grass, and something ancient and wild that you only notice when you're truly alone in the wilderness. Kamau set up our tents carefully, making sure everything was secure. He built a fire pit, gathered wood, and kept reminding me to stay close to the fire once night fell. The sun went down in a wash of red and orange, and soon darkness swallowed the park. I was exhausted from the heat and the travel, so I fell asleep quickly inside my tent. The fabric was thin, and I could hear the faint sounds of the bush around me. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals in the grass, the occasional distant call of a bird. But then, deep into the night, I woke up to a sound that hit something deep inside my brain, something primal and terrifying. A lion was roaring, not just a soft growl or a warning, but a full guttural, bone-shaking roar, close enough to make my heart slam against my ribs. I froze in my sleeping bag for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just one lion. The roar was answered by another, and then another. Somewhere off in the distance, elephants trumpeted in reply. It was like the entire park had suddenly come alive with a wild and dangerous symphony. Nothing I have ever experienced before or since has touched that part of my brain that feels pure, raw fear. The lions were near, and I was right in their home. I forced myself to move. I carefully unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cool night air. The fire was just a few feet away, and I could see Kamau already awake, crouched by the flames, adding more wood and coaxing the fire to burn higher. The flames threw long shadows across the clearing, and the crackling sound was somehow comforting. Kamau told me later that the fire was the one thing that keeps the lions and other predators from coming too close. Without it, I would have been in real danger. As I sat by the fire, my eyes fixed on the edge of the camp where the darkness seemed to hold more secrets than I wanted to imagine. A few hundred yards away, at the edge of the camp, was a man camping alone. I didn't know him, hadn't met him since we arrived, but there he was, a small figure barely visible in the moonlight. Suddenly, his tent started moving. I watched as the fabric rustled and shifted, and then I heard the zipper slide open. The man jumped out, running flat out toward his Land Rover parked just a few steps away, no more than 50 feet from his tent. He jumped in, slammed the door, and started the engine. The whole thing looked so sudden, so frantic. At the time, it felt almost funny in the strange way that only a fight or flight moment can be. But it was clear he wasn't sticking around to test the night. In the morning, when the sun finally began to warm the earth again, Kamau and I walked around the campsite. We found tracks, dozens of them, lions. Over 35 lions, maybe more, a pride that had been circling us during the night, watching, waiting. The sheer number of them, their proximity to our camp, made me realize how close I had come to something dangerous, how fragile the line was between safety and being prey in the wild. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched for the rest of the day. Every rustle in the grass, every distant sound made me glance over my shoulder. I learned that in places like Savo, you're never really alone. The wilderness is full of eyes, ears, and teeth. You just have to hope the fire stays lit. After that trip, I thought nothing would come close to that kind of primal fear. But a few months later, I found myself camping on a remote beach in Northern California, and the kind of fear I experienced there was different, but no less real. This place was wild in a different way, still cold and remote. I had hiked several miles over the headlands to reach it, camping near cliffs that looked out over the endless Pacific Ocean. The water crashed against the rocks far below, white foam glinting in the weak sunlight. The sky was often gray or misty, and the wind whipped cold and salty against my skin. I was alone, completely alone. No cell service, no other campers, no signs of life except seabirds and the sound of the waves. The isolation was total, and that gave the place a quiet that felt unnatural. I have been to many remote places before and grew up on the coast north of San Francisco, but this beach was something else. It was beautiful but eerie, the kind of place that makes you watch your back even when you're the only person around. On the day I arrived, I passed a couple hiking the trail in. They looked normal, no trouble at all. We exchanged quiet nods, nothing more. They went off in the opposite direction, and I thought nothing more of it. I set up my tent on a small flat area near the cliffs, careful to pitch it far enough from the edge. The night came quickly, and the wind picked up. I made a small fire on the beach and settled in with a book, the ocean's roar filling the silence around me. For 3 days, I explored the area, climbing the cliffs, wandering the tide pools, and listening to the wind. I never saw another person except for one car parked miles away at the only pullout on the narrow coastal road. The remoteness felt like both a gift and a threat. It was pure solitude, but also pure vulnerability. Then, the news came. I was still at the camp when I heard it on the radio. 2 people had been found decapitated in their tent, just a few miles down the coast, in a place almost exactly like mine. The police said it was a brutal, violent crime, and they hadn't found any suspects. The details were sparse, but the image stuck in my mind like a dark stain. The location matched where I had camped and where I had seen that couple hiking in. I didn't know if the couple I had passed was the same couple or if it was some other people. I never saw anyone else. The fact that no one was caught, no explanation given, left the story open-ended in my mind. I packed up my things quickly after that, but the feeling of being watched and the silence of the place made me check over my shoulder more than once. The ocean never stopped roaring, and the wind never stopped howling, but the beach was no longer peaceful for me. It was a reminder that even the most beautiful places can hide darkness. The kind of darkness that doesn't come from nature, but from something much more human and just as terrifying. I left the coast with a heavy feeling in my chest, knowing that some places carry stories you don't want to be part of, but sometimes they find you anyway. Both those experiences, so far apart in the world, stayed with me. One was the raw power of wild animals, the other the cold reality of human violence. Neither involved ghosts or shadows, just the harsh truths of life in the wild and in isolation. They taught me that fear isn't always about monsters or myths. Sometimes it's about being truly exposed, knowing that survival depends on a single spark of fire or a quick dash to a truck. And sometimes it's about realizing that the scariest things aren't roaring lions or crashing waves, but the silence that follows a terrible crime and the questions it leaves unanswered. I'm going to tell you about one of the most unsettling nights I've ever had while camping. It still sticks with me, almost 2 years later. It happened up in the Mary's Peak area, near Corvallis, Oregon. My girlfriend and I had planned a weekend getaway to get away from the city and just chill out in nature for a bit. We're both pretty low-key people, and we decided to go car camping since it was easier with all our stuff and didn't require hauling gear for miles. We found a spot overlooking a valley, a quiet dead-end dirt road with just enough room for a few cars. The view was amazing, especially at sunset, with the valley stretching out below and hills rolling on the horizon. We set up early, got the car positioned to block some of the wind, and settled inside with a few beers, just enjoying the peace. As night fell, the air cooled and the stars started popping out one by one. We had the car windows slightly fogged up from the heat inside, the faint glow of our small LED lights casting shadows in the car. We were talking, laughing, just winding down, when around 10 to 10:30 p.m., we heard the crunch of tires on gravel coming from down the road. We looked out and saw a group of trucks pull up to the overlook spot, just a little ways from us, maybe 10 feet from where we were parked. They stopped, and a few guys got out, standing near their vehicles and staring out of the valley. You could tell they noticed us right away. The windows were fogged, and the lights inside the car made it clear we were there. They didn't say anything, just looked around quietly. I remember feeling a little on edge because it was late and we were all alone except for these strangers showing up uninvited. The trucks were big, flashy, and new. I noticed a Denali, some lifted pickups, all spotless except for the dust from the road. They stayed there for a few minutes, scanning the view and probably noticing us watching them back. Then they climbed back in and drove off, their engines rumbling down the dirt road, leaving us with a strange feeling. At first, we told ourselves it was nothing, maybe just some other campers or guys out for a late-night cruise. It was a dead-end road, so it didn't make much sense why they were stopping so close to us, but whatever. We went back to chilling inside the car, trying to shake off the weird vibe. We talked about what we'd do if things got sketchy, but honestly, we both figured it was just harmless. About 30 to 45 minutes later, we started getting ready to call a night. The beers had made us relaxed, and the cool mountain air was starting to chill the car. Just as we were pulling the blankets out and turning off the lights, we heard engines roaring again. This time, it was faster and louder. The same group of trucks came barreling up the dirt road, this time stopping maybe 20 or 30 feet from us, right in front of the car. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I could see their shadows in the trees around us. They stayed inside their trucks, sitting still for a few minutes, engines idling. My heart started pounding. Something felt wrong. We could hear muffled voices, but couldn't make out what they were saying. The air was thick with tension. Then suddenly, all at once, every single one of them jumped out. They weren't just standing around anymore. They had rifles and pistols, and without any warning, they started shooting down the dead-end road in the opposite direction from us. The noise was deafening in the still night. Bullets ripping through the air, echoing off the hills and trees. We were frozen, caught between panic and disbelief. They were just firing wildly, aiming nowhere near us, but close enough to make it clear they wanted to scare whoever was around. We sat in the car, both drunk enough to be disoriented, but sober enough to realize how dangerous this was. I grabbed my girlfriend's hand and looked at our stuff piled in the back seat. All our camping gear, clothes, and some food. The car was our only safe place, but I knew we couldn't stay. I threw on whatever I could find, just my underwear and a jacket, and got behind the wheel. The roads here were narrow, winding dirt paths with no streetlights. I didn't want to risk getting pulled over on the main road for DUI, so I decided to drive away quietly, far from the mess. We peeled out, tires kicking up dust as we headed down the road, not looking back. The truck stayed there for a while, still shooting off rounds, but after a few minutes, they took off in the opposite direction, their headlights disappearing into the darkness. We didn't stop driving until we'd put about 30 minutes between ourselves and that spot. Eventually, I pulled into another place I knew, a more secluded clearing I'd been to before. We parked, tried to calm down, and lay back, but the adrenaline kept us wired. The quiet that night wasn't peaceful anymore. Every small sound felt amplified. Every shadow seemed alive. We couldn't sleep. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animals, felt like threats instead of nature. The next morning, we drove back to where we'd been. The place was empty except for the trash they'd left behind. A bunch of empty White Claw cans scattered around, about 20 or more. Shell casings littered the ground, proof of the shooting the night before. It was clear they had been drinking and shooting for hours, probably drunk frat boys or locals showing off their guns. The nice trucks, the beer, the reckless shooting, all made me realize how lucky we were that night. That experience changed something for me. I'd never owned a gun or really thought about carrying one. I always figured you just stay calm and don't cause trouble. But after that night, I seriously considered getting something for protection if I ever went camping again. The wilderness isn't always about animals or weather. Sometimes it's the people who make it dangerous. I think what sticks with me most is how quickly things shifted from peaceful to threatening. One moment we were just sitting in the car, looking out over the valley, and the next we were fleeing scared for our lives. The whole time, it was just human behavior. No ghosts, no monsters, just people acting reckless and aggressive. It was a raw, real reminder that sometimes the scariest part of being out in nature is not nature itself, but the people you can run into. Since then, I've been more careful where and when I camp. I keep my phone charged, I know alternate routes, and I try to avoid camping late at night near places that could attract groups like that. It's not paranoia, it's experience. That night on Mary's Peak taught me that the world can turn on a dime, and sometimes the people around you can be more dangerous than any wild animal. That's the story. I don't tell it often, but every time I think about camping, that night always comes back. It was a clear, dark night, a quiet spot, and then a sudden rush of fear from people, not nature. And that's the real kind of scary. The first time I took my now wife backpacking was a trip I still think about a lot. We were both pretty new to the whole thing, but excited to get away from the city and into the woods for a few days. I picked a trail that wasn't too long, but had a good mix of scenery. Some thick forest, a creek crossing, and a few clearings where we could see the sky. It was early spring, so the weather was still cool and a little unpredictable, but perfect for hiking without overheating. We started early in the morning, carrying our packs loaded with everything we need: tent, sleeping bags, food, water, and some basic gear. The trail was quiet except for the sounds of birds and the crunch of our boots on the dirt path. It didn't take long before we spotted something unusual: fresh cougar tracks right along the edge of the trail. The prints were big, clear, and looked like they had just passed through. We paused to look closer, tracing the paw prints with our eyes as they went up the path deeper into the forest. It wasn't something to freak out about. Cougar tracks are pretty common in the area, and it was hard to tell exactly how old the tracks were. They might have been a few hours old or a day old. The prints just added a little thrill to the hike. We joked about it quietly. Neither of us wanted to make a big deal out of it. The trail was wide enough and open enough that if the cat was still around, it would probably have moved on. We kept walking, following the trail as it wound through the trees, crossed a small creek, and climbed a gentle slope. The forest was thick with pines and firs, their needles covering the ground like a soft carpet. A light rain started to fall, soft and steady, just enough to make the forest smell fresh and clean. We didn't mind. It was relaxing to hear the rain tapping on the leaves above us as we found a spot to set up camp. We picked a clearing not far off the trail, flat and sheltered by trees. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough for our first night. We laid out the tent, pitched it carefully, and made a small fire nearby to warm us up. The rain kept falling, a quiet pattering that helped us fall asleep as we listened to the forest settle around us. Morning came cold and clear. When I unzipped the tent and peeked outside, the first thing I noticed was how different everything looked. The rain had stopped, but the ground around us was covered with prints. Lots of prints. Cougar prints. Every inch of earth, moss, and mud was stamped with the big paw marks. It was like the cat, or cats, had walked all around us during the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. These prints weren't just passing through. They had come close, sniffed around the tent. I could see clear impressions where it had pressed its nose into the earth, right by the sides of the tent where our heads had been resting. The prints circled again, sometimes overlapping, like it was trying to figure us out, inspecting us carefully without making any noise. I shook my wife awake quietly. We packed up quickly, not saying much. There was no sign of the animal now, no growls or cries, just the fresh tracks in the mud. We started out following a pair of tracks leading back the way we had come. They were easier to follow in the morning light. The cat hadn't gone far. The walkout was tense but quiet. We stayed close together, watching and listening for any sign. The forest was still and empty, no sounds but birds and the drip of melting rain from the branches. The cougar stayed invisible. We didn't hear it move or see it anywhere. It was like it was following us just out of sight, keeping pace without making a sound. I tried to convince myself it wasn't hungry enough to come closer, or maybe it was just curious and cautious. The early spring meant it might be hungry after a long winter, but not desperate enough to risk attacking a tent full of people. Whatever the reason, it left us alone, but the memory of those prints all around us was something I couldn't shake. Years later, when we went back to the same trail, the forest felt different. That time, we saw two black bear cubs playing right next to the path. They were small, clumsy, running up and down a tree, tumbling over each other like puppies. For a long moment, we just watched them, frozen in place. There was no sign of their mother nearby. It was strange and a little worrying, but the cubs seemed happy enough. We took some pictures, careful not to get too close. I pulled out my revolver, just in case. I'm not proud of carrying a gun backpacking, but in the back of my mind, I know the wilderness isn't always kind. We started moving again, talking loudly, so the bears could hear us and stay away. My wife walked in front, so I could see her and keep an eye on anything coming from behind. That's when she spotted the mother. She was on the opposite side of the trail, standing just inside the trees. We were right between her and the cubs. My heart jumped. The mother bear was big, solid, and watching us carefully with sharp eyes. We didn't stop or speed up. We kept walking at the same slow, steady pace, talking so she knew we weren't a threat. The mother bear watched for a long moment, then turned back toward her cubs. We kept moving without breaking stride. The cubs scattered into the brush while the mother moved quietly after them. I put away my pistol after that, relieved but still alert. It was the closest I've ever come to feeling truly afraid on the trail. Not because of some ghost story or wild imagination, but because I was face to face with a wild animal who could end us with a single swipe. I've always thought people scare me more than any animal I've ever met in the wild. There's something about how unpredictable and dangerous people can be that stays with me more than a cougar's tracks or a bear's growl. Backpacking with my wife is still something we do often. Each trip teaches me something new about the wilderness and about her. But that first trip with the cougar prints all around our tent, and that time with the bear cubs and their mom watching us silently from the trees, those moments stand out as reminders. The wild isn't a place where you get to be careless. It's a place where respect, caution, and awareness matter most. And where sometimes the quietest sounds, like the sniff of a cougar in the night or the soft steps of a mother bear, can teach you the most important lessons. The night we spent in the White Mountains still sticks with me, even weeks later. I keep turning it over in my mind, trying to make sense of what happened. There were two strange things that night. Things I'm not sure are connected, but both left me feeling uneasy. I've told a few people, but most just brush it off or try to give some easy explanation. I want to share exactly what I saw and felt. No fancy stories or made-up stuff. Just what happened. We were camping a fairly quiet spot in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, late September. It was a new moon, so the night was almost completely dark. No moonlight at all, just a faint, distant glow of the stars if you looked up. My girlfriend, our friend, and I had picked this spot because it was remote, surrounded by thick woods, and we wanted to get away from the city noise for a few days. The campground was mostly empty. Only a few sites were taken. We set up our tent in a flat clearing with pine trees all around. The air smelled like damp earth and fallen leaves. It was the kind of place that feels peaceful by day, but changes after dark. I remember it was chilly that evening. We had a campfire going for warmth and to cook some food. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the black sky. We talked quietly, told stories, and watched the flames. Eventually, we all got tired and went to bed around 11. The forest sounds slowly filled the air. The rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the snap of a twig. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But a couple hours after I'd fallen asleep, I woke up needing to pee. It was completely dark inside our tent. I unzipped the flaps slowly and stepped outside, careful not to trip on anything. The cold air hit my face immediately. I grabbed my flashlight from the tent's pocket and clicked it on, but kept it aimed low so I wouldn't disturb the others. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles, and I could see the faint outline of trees all around. I made my way toward the campground's trash area, which was just a short walk down the path from our site. The path was narrow, barely more than a dirt trail, surrounded by dense woods on either side. When I dropped off the trash and started heading back, something caught my eye toward the back of an empty campsite nearby. I wasn't sure what it was at first. The shape was pale, almost white or light gray, and it stood out against the dark background of trees and shadows. At first, I thought maybe it was a person collecting kindling or something. I imagined someone crouched or standing still, trying not to make noise. But the shape didn't move, not even a little. I watched for a moment, waiting to see if it would shift or turn. Nothing. It just stayed there like some kind of statue or a big piece of pale cloth hanging in the dark. I thought maybe it was a birch tree, but that spot was strange for one. Birch trees usually grow in groups or open areas, not right in the middle of a campsite, especially one that was empty. It didn't look like bark either, more like smooth, pale skin or fabric. I felt my stomach tighten with a strange feeling, a mix of curiosity and something like fear. I told myself I'd check it out in the morning when I could see clearly. I didn't want to get too close in the dark. I finished the walk back to our tent, tried to shake off the feeling, and crawled back into my sleeping bag. But the image of that pale shape stuck in my mind. I lay awake for a while, listening to the forest sounds, tried to convince myself it was nothing. Later that night, maybe an hour after I got back to the tent, my girlfriend woke up and went outside too. When she came back, she looked shaken. She said she saw something strange, glowing coals scattered around the tent area and further into the woods. At first, I thought she was imagining things, but then I got up to pee again and saw them myself. The glowing coals were faint, but definitely there, like someone had taken the ashes and hot embers from a fire and scattered them around in little piles or patches. They glowed with a dull orange light, just bright enough to be noticed in the pitch black. The weirdest part was how spread out they were around the tent, near trees, and deeper into the forest. It didn't make sense. We hadn't moved any coals or ashes after putting out our fire hours earlier. There were no campfires anywhere near those spots that night, and no one else was camping close enough to do it. I took a closer look at a few patches. The coals looked cold, like they'd stopped glowing hours ago, but somehow kept a faint ember light. There was no smell of smoke or burning wood, which you'd expect if they were fresh. Just that strange glowing, like dying embers refusing to go out. The ground around the coals was dark and damp. My friend was awake by then and came outside to see. He saw the coals too and got uneasy. We all stood there in silence, shining our flashlights around the tent and woods, trying to figure out what was going on. It felt like something was watching us, just beyond the reach of the light. We didn't say much after that. I went back to the tent and tried to sleep, but my mind was racing. The pale shape, the glowing coals, they felt connected somehow. Maybe it was a sign or a warning, or maybe just the weird tricks of the forest at night. I don't know. Morning came slow. When the sun finally rose, it turned the woods from dark and shadowy to bright and clear. I made my way over to that empty campsite where I'd seen the pale shape. In the daylight, I looked all around carefully. There was no birch tree or anything pale in that spot. Instead, I saw only the normal dark brown bark of pine and maple trees. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, undisturbed. I asked my girlfriend and friend to come check. None of us could find any sign of what I'd seen the night before. No pale figure, no weird white shape, no kindling collector. Just the empty campsite, quiet and still. We packed up that day and left the mountains, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Back home, we started talking about what we saw and what it could mean. We looked up local stories about strange sightings in that area, Coos County, New Hampshire. That's when we came across something called the Wood Devil. The Wood Devil isn't a ghost or monster like you see in movies. It's described as a tall, pale figure that moves silently through the woods. People who claim to have seen it say it stands out because of its pale skin, almost glowing white against the dark trees. Some say it watches from the shadows, always just out of reach or sight. It's a local legend, a mysterious presence that some say is real and others dismiss as folklore. Thinking about the Wood Devil gave me chills. It matched what I saw, the pale figure that didn't move, the strange glowing coals like embers scattered in the forest. Maybe it's a creature or just a trick of the light, but I don't think I imagined it. I felt the fear and confusion when I saw those things, and I still feel it now when I remember. That night in the White Mountains wasn't just a camping trip. It was something else, something real and strange that I can't explain. Maybe it's best left as a mystery, but I know one thing. The woods around us hold more secrets than we want to believe, and some things don't want to be found or understood. The sun was just starting to dip behind the giant granite walls of Yosemite, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. It was the early 1980s, and I was part of my high school's backpacking trip through the park. We were a group of about 15 kids, all loaded down with heavy packs, trying to keep up with our 2 adult leaders. It was the kind of trip you don't forget. Rough, raw, and real. No phones, no music, just the sounds of the wilderness and us trying to make it day by day. We were following a group of campers who had come through just a day or 2 before us. They were a horseback riding group, and as we hiked from campsite to campsite, it quickly became clear they hadn't been the most careful visitors. Every place they stopped looked worse than the last. Garbage scattered here and there, the smell of fish guts left behind from cleaning their catch, and the latrines. Well, let's just say they didn't follow any kind of leave no trace rules. It was the kind of careless mess that sticks with you in a place as beautiful as Yosemite. It felt disrespectful, and honestly, it put us on edge. One campsite stood out more than the others. It was tucked away in a little clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick brush and towering pines. We saw the remains of their campfire, mostly just a circle of blackened stones with smoldering ashes. But then I noticed something wrong. The edge of the fire had caught onto the dry duff, the layer of pine needles, leaves, and twigs on the forest floor. It was a small fire, but it was alive and hungry, creeping slowly but surely into the underbrush. We all froze for a moment, understanding the danger. A fire in Yosemite in late summer was no joke. The park was dry, and a careless spark could turn into a raging blaze that would destroy everything. Without saying much, we dropped our packs without hesitation and rushed down to the creek nearby. The water was cold and clear, flowing fast enough to carry leaves and pine needles downstream. With the few small plastic water bottles we had, we began scooping water and splashing it on the edges of the fire. The smoke was thick, and it burned my eyes as I worked to put it out. A few of us kicked at the edges of the fire with sticks, trying to break up the burning material, and slowly, the flames shrank. Just as we were making progress, something moved in the bushes behind us. I felt it before I saw it, a heavy, creeping silence, the kind you get just before something big and dangerous steps into your space. Then I caught the flash of dark fur, the heavy bulk moving quickly but silently. It was a bear, a big one, probably a black bear, but still large and intimidating. Before anyone could react, it darted toward me and grabbed my backpack. I was frozen for a split second, shock, fear, disbelief, all crashing over me. Then instinct took over. I shouted, but no one could hear me over the rush of the creek and the thud of my heartbeat in my ears. The bear took off running, my pack swinging from its jaws. I dropped my water bottle and sprinted after it. The other kids followed, shouting and scrambling after us. We ran down the trail, the bear dodging between trees and rocks, weaving through the forest like it belonged there, which it did. It was fast, much faster than any of us, but it wasn't planning on keeping the pack forever. After about a quarter mile, it made a mistake. The bear ran toward two small trees growing close together, trying to slip between them. My backpack was too big to fit through, and as the bear tried to force its way, the metal frame bent and twisted, and the large front pocket tore away, dropping some of my lunches onto the forest floor. The bear snarled, pulled back, and shook its head, irritated and confused. It dropped the pack and disappeared into the trees on the other side. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the mangled backpack, feeling the weight of the torn frame and missing pocket. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through me, but I knew I had to keep moving. I looked back at the others. They were all breathing hard, faces pale but relieved. We ran for nearly a mile without stopping, constantly looking over our shoulders for any sign the bear might come back or follow us. The forest was dense, the ground uneven and covered in pine needles and rocks. My legs were burning, but the fear kept me going. Finally, we slowed down and stopped near a larger clearing where the leaders had set up camp for the night. The sun was almost gone, and the air was cooling rapidly. We all sat down heavily, the reality of what had happened starting to sink in. The backpack was ruined, the frame bent beyond repair, my lunches gone, and my gear shoved awkwardly inside. But I was alive. None of us had gotten hurt, and the bear had moved on. That night, lying in my sleeping bag under a sky filled with stars, I thought about how close we had come to something much worse. The bear hadn't been just curious or hungry. It had been bold enough to come into our camp, and the fire left unattended could have been a disaster. The next morning, we packed up quickly, double-checking the campfire site to make sure everything was safe. We left no trace, and I think that day taught all of us something important about respect for the land, for the animals, and for each other. The trip continued, and while we faced other challenges, nothing felt as real or as close as that moment with the bear and the fire. It wasn't a story about ghosts or myths. It was just nature showing us that it's not something to mess with, that mistakes can have serious consequences, and that sometimes all you can do is run and hope for the best. It started as a normal trip, nothing special. I want to get away from the city noise and crowds for a few days. I found this old cabin online, tucked deep in the woods of a state park not too far from where I live. The pictures made it look quiet, isolated, and perfect for some peace. No cell signal, no internet, just me in the forest for a while. I packed up some food, a small stove, water, and warm clothes. The drive was long but peaceful, mostly country roads, winding through hills and dense trees. The kind of drive where you feel the tension in your shoulders start to ease. When I arrived, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, almost swallowed by the forest around it. It looked older than the picture showed, but not run down, just weathered. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I stepped inside. It smelled like wood smoke and something earthy, like the forest had settled in through the cracks and crevices over the years. Inside was simple, a small kitchen with an old stove, a table, a few chairs, and a worn-out couch. A wood stove sat in the corner, with a pile of chopped wood stacked neatly beside it. There was one bedroom with a creaky bed and a small bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. Nothing fancy, but enough to make me comfortable for a few nights. I unpacked, made a small fire in the stove, and settled in with a book. Outside, the forest was quiet, except for the usual sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I had expected some noise from wildlife, but the silence felt heavier, deeper than usual. Not an eerie silence, but a silence that made you notice every little sound more sharply, like the forest was listening. The first night passed uneventfully. I went to bed early, the wood stove warming the room as I drifted off. I woke up a few times, hearing strange sounds outside. The crack of a branch, the soft padding of something moving. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I decided to explore a little. There was a trailhead not far from the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I packed some water and my phone, even though I knew the signal was weak or non-existent here. I wanted to get a feel for the area, maybe find a good spot to sit and just take it all in. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places. The trees stood tall, their branches creating a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft green glow. The air was cool and smelled like pine and damp earth. I walked slowly, listening to the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots. Every now and then, I would stop to look around, noticing how still everything was except for the occasional bird or the flutter of a squirrel disappearing into the trees. After about an hour, I came to a small clearing with a shallow creek running through it. The water was clear and cold, and I knelt down to splash some on my face. Sitting on a fallen log, I took a deep breath and just let myself relax. The forest was beautiful here, but something felt off, like I was being watched, but there was no one there. I stayed there for a while, drinking water and listening to the creek. Eventually, I turned back to the cabin, following the trail the way I came. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. My footprints were missing. I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked down at the dirt path, expecting to see the prints I had just made, clear and fresh. But the ground looked undisturbed, like I hadn't walked there at all. I frowned and looked around, tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe the rain had come overnight and washed them away, but there was no mud, no water, no sign of rain at all. Shrugging it off, I kept walking. When I got closer to the cabin, I saw something else that unsettled me. The door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it when I left. The wind could have pushed it, but the cabin was tucked away and the trees blocked most of the breeze. Still, I pushed the door shut and locked it, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. Inside, everything seemed normal. I made lunch and sat by the window watching the forest. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the trees. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. That evening, as the sky darkened and the fire in the stove crackled, I heard a noise outside. It was a soft scraping, like something dragging across the dirt. I froze and listened. The sound stopped, but then I heard it again, coming from the far side of the cabin. Slowly, I got up and peeked out the window. Nothing was there, just the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer moving through the leaves. But the sound was too deliberate, too slow for something small. I locked the doors and windows again and tried to calm myself down with a cup of tea. The night stretched on, and I stayed awake, alert to every little noise. On the third day, I decided to stay inside most of the time. I didn't want to wander off and get lost, or worse, have another strange thing happen. I cooked some stew on the stove and read my book. The forest outside seemed peaceful, but the tension inside me grew. That afternoon, I noticed something else was wrong. My backpack, which I had left by the door, was moved. Not far, just a few feet, but it wasn't where I left it. I checked inside it quickly. Everything was there, nothing missing. But the fact it had been moved without me noticing made my skin crawl. I sat down and tried to think logically. Maybe an animal had pushed it? Could the wind have moved it? I searched for footprints or signs of someone else nearby, but found nothing. No other footprints, no broken branches, no trash or signs of human presence. The sun began to set, and I felt trapped in the cabin, like I was being watched by something I couldn't see. The forest around me suddenly felt like a cage. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The scratching came again, louder this time, circling the cabin slowly, stopping and starting. I stayed by the window with a flashlight, shining it into the dark trees. Nothing moved. When dawn came, I felt exhausted but relieved. I made coffee and sat outside for the first time in 2 days. The morning air was cold, and the birds sang loudly as if mocking my fear. I decided I needed to leave, not because I was afraid of ghosts or monsters, but because this place, as real and alive as it was, wasn't safe for me. The feeling of being watched, the missing footprints, the moved backpack, something was wrong. I packed quickly and locked the cabin door behind me. As I walked back down the dirt road, the forest seemed to watch me silently. I didn't look back until I reached my car. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the road, winding through the trees. The cabin faded into the distance, swallowed by the forest once again. I never went back. Later, I learned from a local ranger that the area had a history of illegal hunters and squatters who sometimes lived in the woods, moving quietly and watching for outsiders. That explained the footprints disappearing. Someone was careful to cover their tracks. It also explained the noises, the door opening, and the moved backpack. Not ghosts, just people. Real people who didn't want visitors. I felt lucky to have left when I did. Now, when I tell this story, I don't talk about ghosts or monsters. The real fear comes from knowing that sometimes the scariest things are the people and the unknown around us. And the forest holds its secrets tight, waiting quietly for the next visitor to find out. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had been wanting to get away from the city for a while. Work was stressful, the noise was nonstop, and we were both burnt out. So when we found that small cabin for rent, way deep in the woods, it felt like the perfect escape. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple wooden cabin surrounded by tall pines, miles from the nearest town. There was no cell service, which we thought was actually a good thing. No distractions, just quiet. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. The inside smelled like a mix of pine and something musty, like it hadn't been used in a while. There was a small living room with a couch and wood stove, a tiny kitchen with basic appliances, and one bedroom with a bed covered in a thick quilt. The bathroom was small and simple. One thing that stood out was the landline phone hanging on the wall near the kitchen. It was an old rotary phone, the kind you don't see much anymore. We joked about how funny it was that the cabin had a phone at all, since there was no cell reception anywhere nearby. The first few days were peaceful. We went hiking during the day, cooked simple meals, and spent evenings sitting by the fire. The woods were quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. The fresh air felt like a relief after the smog of the city. The first night, though, something odd happened. About 10 minutes before we were ready to turn in, the phone rang. The shrill sound echoed through the quiet cabin. Sarah jumped a little, and I was surprised because I figured no one could call here with no cell service. I walked over and picked up the receiver. There was nothing, just heavy breathing on the other end. It wasn't fast or panicked, just slow, deep breathing. I thought maybe someone was messing with the phone line, or it was a prank call from the town miles away. I told Sarah it was probably nothing and hung up. The next night, the phone rang again. Same thing, heavy breathing. This time it was louder, clearer. Sarah was getting nervous, but I said it was probably a prank or a glitch. I didn't want to ruin our peaceful trip with paranoia. Night after night, the calls kept coming at around the same time, usually late at night after we'd gone to bed. The breathing grew louder, heavier. It felt like whoever was on the other end was getting closer, or maybe breathing right into the mouthpiece. We never heard any words, just the breathing. I tried unplugging the phone once, but it still rang. The cabin's wiring must be old, but the phone was connected to some line that worked independently of electricity. The calls kept coming. Sarah started sleeping with one eye open, and I caught myself double-checking the locks on the doors. We never saw or heard anyone outside, but the feeling that something was wrong kept creeping up on us. On the third night, I decided to stay up after the phone rang. I waited by the phone, staring at it, trying to catch something, maybe a noise, a pattern, anything that might explain it. When it rang again, I picked up slowly. The breathing was so loud, it almost sounded like it was in the room with me. I held the phone away, breathing hard myself. The sound stopped suddenly, and then, barely audible, a whisper came through. I froze. The whisper said, "I'm inside the cabin." I dropped the phone back onto the cradle, my hands shaking. Sarah woke up and saw my face, and I told her what I heard. We moved through the cabin quickly, checking every room, opening every closet and cabinet. We looked under the bed, behind the curtains, even in the small crawl space under the floor. No one was there. The wind outside was calm, the woods silent. But the feeling of being watched was heavy in the air. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. Sarah held a flashlight and a kitchen knife. I kept a heavy flashlight and a metal baseball bat by my side. Every time I thought I heard a noise, a creak, a rustle, my heart jumped. We stayed awake until morning, too scared to close our eyes. When the sun finally came up, I went to check the phone again. The landline was ripped from the wall. The cord was torn out roughly, like someone had grabbed it and yanked hard. I swear, it looked like it had been pulled by a person standing right behind me. Sarah and I looked at each other, our faces pale. There was no way anyone could have been in the cabin without us seeing or hearing them the whole night. No footprints in the dirt outside, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. We packed our things quickly, too shaken to stay another minute. Driving back to the city, neither of us said much, just stared ahead. The woods looked normal, peaceful even, but something in those trees had been wrong. I've thought about what it could have been 1,000 times since then. Maybe someone was stalking the cabin, someone who knew the phone was our only way in or out. Maybe they were waiting for us to relax, so they could get close. The fact that the breathing got louder each night, like they were getting closer and closer, still haunts me. And that whisper, "I'm inside the cabin," it wasn't a joke or a game. It was a warning. When we got back to the city, I called the rental company. They said no one else had rented the cabin since the previous renters left weeks before us. They promised to send someone to check it out. I never went back, and neither did Sarah. I still have nightmares about that breathing, about the feeling of someone just out of sight, watching me. The image of the ripped phone cord on the wall, like someone had been standing right behind me when I checked it, is burned into my mind. The woods around that cabin are quiet, but they aren't safe. Sometimes I wonder if that someone is still out there, waiting for the next renters, the next couple looking for peace and quiet. And maybe one day, they'll get what they want. I rented the cabin by the lake because I wanted a quiet place to write my novel. City life had become too noisy, too distracting. I needed peace and solitude, a place where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the lapping of the water against the shore. The cabin was small, just one room with a kitchen corner and a tiny bathroom. It sat right at the water's edge, surrounded by tall pine trees, with a small wooden dock jutting out into the lake. The view was perfect for writing, or so I thought. The first few days were exactly what I wanted. I would wake up early, make coffee on the old gas stove, and sit by the window with my laptop, watching the sun rise over the water. I barely saw any people. The nearest town was miles away, and the road to the cabin was rough and unpaved. It felt like the perfect place to focus. Across the lake, about a quarter-mile away, there was another cabin. It was a bit bigger than mine, and from what I could tell, it looked empty. The paint was peeling, the porch swing was broken, and there were no signs of life. No smoke from a chimney, no car parked nearby. It was like the place had been abandoned for years. At least, that's what I thought. But then, the noises started. It was around the third night when I first heard the footsteps. I was sitting inside, typing away when I caught the sound of slow, heavy steps outside. I looked toward the window that faced the other cabin. The moon was bright, and I could just make out the shape of the porch on the other side of the lake. The steps were on the porch, the creak of old wood under a heavy foot. But the porch looked empty. I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer, or something big moving around on the other side of the lake. But then came a knocking. Soft, deliberate knocks on my cabin's windows. I froze. It was late, maybe close to midnight. I got up slowly and walked over to the window. Nothing, just the dark trees and the still water. The next day, I went down to the lake and stared at the other cabin. It still looked empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, watching me, waiting. I didn't want to believe it, but the knocking and footsteps didn't seem like coincidence or an animal. Someone was out there. I tried to ignore it first, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the sounds kept coming every night, always the footsteps on the porch of the other cabin, always the knocking on my windows. Sometimes the knocks were light, sometimes they were harder, like someone was trying to get my attention. On the 5th day, I took my old rowboat out across the lake. I wanted to see the other cabin up close to figure out if anyone was living there. Maybe the knocking was some prank or a neighbor wanted to spook me. As I rowed, the water was calm and cold, the sky overcast. I could see the cabin clearly now. It was surrounded by thick bushes and fallen branches, and the porch looked more run down than I had thought. When I reached the shore, I tied my boat to a tree and walked up to the cabin. The door was boarded up with old wooden planks nailed in a haphazard way. The windows were covered with plywood and dirt. It looked like no one had lived here for years. But then I saw something that made my heart race. On the ground near the cabin, there was a small pile of trash. Empty food wrappers, a crushed soda can, and a burnt-out campfire surrounded by blackened stones. The fire was fresh. I could smell the smoke still lingering in the air. Someone had been here recently. I circled the cabin, looking for another way in. I found a small gap behind one of the boards on the side of the porch, just big enough to slip inside. I pushed the board aside and crawled in through the darkness. The inside was dusty and filled with cobwebs. Old furniture lay broken in corners. The smell of damp wood and mildew filled the air. But in the center of the room was a small notebook lying on a table. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, notes, and sketches. Most of it didn't make sense, but some lines caught my eye. The quiet man writes every day. He never notices. He thinks he's alone, watching, waiting. Another note said, "Doesn't know I'm here, but I know everything." He talks to himself. I hear him. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been living in this cabin, watching me for weeks, maybe even longer. They had been hiding, staying just out of sight, watching me work and waiting for something. I backed out of the cabin, heart pounding. The idea that someone had been watching me all this time, knocking on my windows, walking on the other porch. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. Someone was living there without my knowledge, observing me, maybe even planning something. I rowed back to my cabin fast, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the forest was still. The lake was still. The only sound was the splash of my oars cutting through the water. That night, I locked every door and window. I sat in the corner with a baseball bat, waiting for any sign of noise. The knocks didn't come. The footsteps were silent. For 2 days, there was nothing. I told myself the watcher had left, or maybe they never really lived there, just a transient camper who moved on. But on the 3rd night, the knocking returned. Softer this time, almost hesitant. And then I heard breathing just outside my window. I didn't sleep again. I packed my things first thing in the morning and left the cabin for good. I didn't report what I found. I didn't call the police. Part of me was afraid that telling anyone would bring more trouble. I just wanted to get away from the lake, from the silence, and from the feeling of being watched. When I drive past that way now, I don't look at the cabin across the lake. I don't want to remember the footsteps, the knocking, or the diary filled with someone else's words. I only think about how close I was to living next door to a stranger who had been silently watching me for weeks, hidden in the shadows. Sometimes I wonder if they're still there, watching, waiting. Maybe someone like that never really leaves. The snow was deep when we arrived at the cabin, almost up to my knees in some places, and the air was sharp and cold. It was the kind of cold that cuts through your jacket and makes your skin feel raw. The cabin itself was an old wooden structure, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to lean in, as if watching us. It stood alone, miles from the nearest town, and the only road leading to it had been plowed recently. leaving a narrow path through the thick snow. We had planned this weekend for months, a break from work and city noise, a chance to breathe fresh mountain air and just get away. The four of us, me, Jake, Sarah, and Mark, had driven up Friday afternoon, unloading the car while the sun dipped low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. Inside, the cabin was cozy but simple. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A few mismatched couches and chairs were scattered around, and a small kitchen with barely enough counter space for 4 people. We found some firewood stacked outside, which was dry and perfect for lighting a fire to keep the biting cold at bay. The first night passed quietly, with the wind howling softly outside, but nothing else unusual. We played cards, drank some cheap beer, and laughed, feeling the tension of everyday life melt away. When it was time to sleep, the temperature had dropped even further, and the cabin's thin walls barely kept the cold out. But the wood stove had done its job, filling the place with warmth, and we all fell asleep under thick blankets. The next morning, Jake was the first to notice something strange. He was the early riser of the group, always up before the rest of us. He went outside to clear some snow from the porch, and was the one who spotted the footprints. They were large, heavy prints circling the cabin, pressed deeply into the fresh snow. What made it so unsettling was that no one had been outside after dark. None of us had left the cabin once the fire was going, and the footprints were fresh, with no signs of melting or snow covering them. The prints were unlike any animal tracks we had seen before. They were too big to be a deer or bear, too heavy to be something smaller, and the shape was oddly human-like but distorted, as if the creature wearing boots had a strange gait or weight distribution. They came close to the windows, stopping just short of the glass, as if whoever or whatever was walking there was watching us inside. We spent the morning examining the prints from outside, trying to find some explanation. Maybe a hunter had wandered near, but there was no sign of any other footprints leading away from the cabin, just this loop around it. No other disturbances in the snow, no marks from skis or snowshoes, nothing. We checked the roads and paths, but there was no sign anyone else had come by. Despite the growing unease, we tried to push it from our minds. The snow was thick, the forest dense, and we told ourselves maybe it was just some kind of animal or a hunter who'd circled the cabin for some reason. We stayed inside for most of the day, gathering wood, cooking, and keeping the fire alive. But as night fell, the air grew colder and heavier. The wind outside shifted, and shadows from the trees moved against the cabin walls like silent figures. That night, when we looked outside again, the footprints had moved closer to the windows. They were still circling, but now pressed up to the very edge of the cabin, where the glass met the wooden frame. The impressions were deeper in the snow, as if the creature had been standing there longer, maybe watching. No one spoke about leaving or going outside after dark anymore. We locked the doors and shuttered the windows, double-checked the firewood piles, and kept the fire roaring to fill the room with light and warmth. We huddled together in the living room, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. On the third day, the footprints were even closer, so close you could see the impressions of the boots against the cabin walls, almost like someone had pressed their weight against the wood. The pattern was the same, circling the cabin over and over, never breaking away or heading off into the woods. We were all tense now, barely sleeping, every sound outside making us jump. The snow was still falling lightly, muffling noises, but sometimes we caught a crack or a scrape like something brushing against a tree or the cabin siding. The forest seemed to close in on us, silent but alive, and the cold outside was nothing compared to the cold not tightening in my stomach. On the 4th morning, the horror became real. I was the first awake. The sun was just beginning to push through the gray clouds, casting pale light over the snow. I noticed right away that Mark's bed was empty. At first, I thought he had gotten up early and gone outside, but when I looked around the cabin, it was clear no one had gone out. The door was closed, locked from inside like we had left it, the windows all shut tight. Then I saw it. Mark's boot, just sitting by the front door on the inside, untouched by snow or dirt. The other boot was missing, and near the door were fresh footprints leading away into the forest. They were Mark's size, but the shape was strange, just like the prints that had circled the cabin. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture, no overturned chairs. It was as if he had walked away quietly, calmly, guided by something none of us could see. The footprints moved steadily into the dense woods and then disappeared beneath the thick trees and deep snow. We searched the cabin and the nearby area for hours, calling his name until our voices were hoarse, but there was no sign of him. No tracks other than those leading from the door, no broken branches or clues. It was like he vanished into the forest itself. After that, we packed what we could and left the cabin immediately. The drive down the mountain was tense and silent. The footprints never followed us beyond the cabin clearing, and when we reached the nearest town, we reported Mark missing to the police. Days later, search parties combed the area, but found nothing. No signs of Mark anywhere in the forest. The strange footprints never appeared again. The only thing left behind was that single boot by the cabin door, standing as a chilling reminder of the mystery we could never explain. Looking back, I can't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching us all along. Something heavy and silent, moving just beyond the trees. And that in the end, it took Mark because he was the only one foolish enough, or maybe unlucky enough, to step too close. I don't know what happened to him, but I know one thing. If you ever rent a cabin in the snow-covered mountains, check the footprints around it. Because some things don't want you there, and some footprints mean far more than just steps in the snow. The first time we saw the cabin, it looked like something out of a history book. It stood at the edge of a small clearing in the woods, weathered but solid, with faded wooden boards and windows that had seen decades of rain and wind. The sign near the gravel driveway said it used to be a ranger station. That alone made it feel special, a bit of history, a place that had once been important to the people who patrol these forests. We had been looking for a quiet place to spend the weekend. My wife, the kids, and I wanted to get away from the city noise and screens, to breathe fresh air and just be together. The listing for the cabin promised rustic charm and total privacy. The price was reasonable, and the photos showed a cozy place with a wood stove and a small kitchen. The idea of staying somewhere with a past, especially a ranger station, gave it a little edge of excitement for me. Pulling up to the cabin, I noticed the peeling green paint on the door and the old metal sign that still said Ranger Station in faded letters. Around the side was a small shed, probably where they kept tools or firewood. The windows were dusty and the curtains yellowed, but the place felt solid, built to last. I stepped inside first, my boots thudding softly on the wooden floorboards. The air smelled of wood smoke, dust, and something faintly like mildew. The living room had a big stone fireplace, empty except for some ashes. A few old chairs sat around a rough wooden table, and there was a small kitchen with basic appliances. The furniture was simple and worn, but everything seemed clean. I flicked the light switch near the door, and the ceiling light blinked twice before steadying. My wife and kids followed in, eyes wide with the kind of wonder that comes with new places. The electricity was old. The lights flickered unpredictably, sometimes buzzing like they wanted to burn out, but then holding steady. We blamed it on the cabin's age and the rural power lines, which sometimes went out in storms around here. There was a fuse box in the corner near the kitchen, covered in dust and cobwebs. I opened it briefly, finding the wires tangled and the switches rusty. It wasn't something I want to touch, but as long as the power stayed on, we didn't worry much. The first night, everything seemed normal enough. We cooked dinner on the stove, ate around the table, and then settled into the living room with blankets and books. The kids went to bed early, excited to sleep in a real cabin. The lights flickered once or twice, but that was all. The second day was full of hiking and exploring. The woods around the cabin were thick with tall pines and maples, the ground soft with fallen leaves. My son, the youngest, was fascinated by the idea that this place had once belonged to a ranger who had watched over these forests. We found an old trail marker nearby, half buried in moss, with peeling paint that barely showed the direction. The kids loved pretending they were explorers. That night, the lights flickered again, sometimes going dim for seconds at a time. I checked the fuse box after dinner, but nothing was obviously wrong. The power cut out once, but came back after a few minutes. I told my family it was just the wiring or the local grid being unstable and to not worry about it. On the third day, the power went out completely just after sunset. It wasn't a quick blink or a flicker. The whole cabin went dark, the sudden silence filling the room. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and clicked it on, its beam cutting through the dark. My wife lit candles, placing them carefully around the room. The kids sat close together on the couch, their faces pale in the soft candlelight. That when my youngest pointed toward the window, there just outside the glass stood a figure. He was small, just like the boy, but wearing something odd, a jacket and pants in a dull green color. He was still, staring in with eyes that seemed sharp and hard to read. The street lamp outside was off, and all the other lights were dark, so the boy's flashlight and the candlelight made the figure stand out against the dark trees. My wife and I turned to look, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadow, no shape. Just the empty dark woods, still and quiet except for the faint wind in the branches. My son insisted the man in green was real, that he was watching us. I looked closer and noticed something on the edge of the room, near the far corner, where the dust and shadows made out a shape hanging from a hook on the wall. It was a jacket, a faded Green Ranger's uniform, old and covered with dust. The pants hung underneath it. I remembered then. The brochure mentioned the ranger who used to live here died in this cabin years ago. The story was vague. They said it was some kind of accident, maybe a heart attack, or was something no one really talked about. The family who rents the cabin now didn't want to bring it up. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The next morning, I went outside to look around the cabin more closely, the uniform heavy in my mind. I checked the windows and the porch carefully, searching for any sign someone could have been outside the night before. The ground was soft from rain the day before, but there were no footprints, no marks, nothing to suggest someone had been standing there. The power cutouts continued during the next days, and the flickering lights got worse. Sometimes the lamps would buzz loudly, the bulbs glowing then going dark. My wife kept candles lit around the room, and I tried to find a local electrician or handyman who could check the wiring, but no one was available nearby. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I found myself sitting near the fireplace with the ranger's jacket pulled out from the hook. It was rough and stiff with age, faded green, fabric cracked and worn. The patches were frayed, the name tag torn. The smell of old leather and sweat came from the collar, like it had been left hanging here for years. I imagined the man who wore it, the ranger who lived here alone, keeping watch over the forest. What happened to him? The brochure didn't say, but the cabin felt like a place that held secrets, the kind that don't get told or get forgotten. The last night we stayed, the power cut out again. This time, it didn't come back for hours. We gathered by candlelight, the house silent except for the wind tapping on the windows. The kids were nervous, and I tried to stay calm for their sake. As I looked out the window, I saw the forest edges clearly in the flickering candlelight. Nothing unusual except the bare trees and the dark underbrush. But then, just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something near the far corner of the porch. A shadow, maybe, or the sleeve of the old green jacket hanging there, moved slightly in the breeze. No man in green stood there. It was just the jacket, swaying softly. The coat rack creaked as it shifted, the fabric rubbing against the wooden wall. The next morning, when the sun rose bright and clear, I went outside and took the jacket down. I held it in my hands and realized something. The flickering lights, the power cutting out, the strange feeling of being watched. It wasn't some ghost or spirit. It was just an old cabin with old wiring and old memories. The power problems were from decades of wear, not something supernatural. The figure my son saw, probably a trick of shadows and the imagination, made stronger by the dark and the strange feeling the place gave off. The jacket hanging in the corner, dusty and forgotten, was a reminder that someone had lived here, someone who had spent a lot of time alone. And maybe, just maybe, the house kept some of that quiet loneliness inside its walls. We left that afternoon, the cabin behind us quiet again. The woods looked normal, the sunlight bright. No man in green followed us. The ranger's story was sad and mysterious, but it was real, and it was enough. Sometimes old places like this remind you that the past is still there, held in the things people leave behind. The creaks in the floor, the flicker of an old light, the smell of dust and leather. Not magic, not ghosts, just the weight of time and memory. That's what the cabin was, a place where history lived quietly, waiting for someone to notice. And for us, that was enough to make it feel a little strange, a little haunting, but also real. The first night I arrived at the cabin, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road or neighbor. The only way in was a narrow dirt path that twisted through thick trees and under low-hanging branches. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I had come here to finish my book, to escape the distractions of the city and the constant buzzing of my phone. The cabin seemed perfect, small, old but sturdy, with creaky wooden floors and walls lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. I unloaded my bags and set my laptop on the worn-out desk by the window. The view was of dense forest, dark and silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I liked the silence. It made it easier to think, to write. My first few days were productive. I barely noticed the passing of time as words poured out, the story taking shape in my mind and on the screen. At night, the cabin creaked and groaned like an old ship in the wind, but it was peaceful, or so I thought. On the third evening, after a long day of writing, I decided to explore the cabin a bit more. It had 2 small bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. But what caught my eye was a heavy wooden door near the back of the kitchen, partially hidden behind an old cupboard. The door was locked tight with a rusty metal latch. It looked out of place, too sturdy for what I assumed was just a storage space. I pushed on it, but it wouldn't budge. Curious, I looked around the cabin for a key, but found nothing. There was no mention of a basement or cellar in the papers I had gotten from the rental agency, which was odd. The cabin's owner was said to be reclusive and rarely rented out, so maybe they just forgot to mention that part. I shrugged it off as unimportant. That night, lying in bed, I heard the first noises. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows. But then I caught something else, soft, muffled sounds from below, like footsteps moving slowly, then stopping. Occasionally, I thought I heard quiet voices, like whispers, but I couldn't make out any words. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe the house settling or animals outside. But the noises came back again the next night, louder and more distinct. I began to dread the basement door. I would lie awake, staring at it, wondering what was down there. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had left things locked away long ago, or it was just an old root cellar. But the voices didn't fit. Who would be down there? I tried to push the thought away and focus on my book, but my writing slowed. I was distracted, nervous. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the dark below. On the 5th night, I could no longer ignore it. I found an old crowbar in the kitchen drawer and crept over to the basement door. My hands trembled as I slid the crowbar under the latch and pried. The metal protested but finally gave way with a loud snap. The door swung open, revealing a set of narrow wooden stairs descending into darkness. I grabbed my phone for light and started down carefully. The air grew colder and damper as I moved lower. The smell of mold and old earth filled my nostrils. My flashlight beam revealed rough stone walls covered in strange carvings, lines and shapes etched deep into the rock, some looking like twisted faces, others like symbols I didn't recognize. The floor was dirt, uneven and scattered with bits of broken glass and old debris. Further in, I saw something that made my skin crawl, a circle drawn on the dirt floor, made of ash or chalk, with strange marks inside it that looked like runes. It was old, but clearly deliberate. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Near the back corner, half buried under a pile of dust and debris, lay a small, leather-bound diary. I picked it up carefully, brushing off the dirt. The pages were yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was jagged and hurried. like the author had been afraid or desperate. I started reading. I locked them down here years ago. Said they were trouble, said they had to stay. No one comes down to this place. They never left. I hear them sometimes, but they don't call out. Just wait, breathing in the dark. I can't let them out. They're mine now. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. The diary didn't say who they were or why, just that someone had been locked in the cellar long ago, forgotten, or imprisoned. I dropped the book back on the floor, stepping back quickly. Suddenly, behind me, the heavy basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, reaching for the handle, but it was locked tight just like before. I banged on the door, shouted, tried to pry it open with a crowbar, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew thick and stale. My phone's battery was low, and the light flickered. Panic rose in my throat as I realized I was trapped underground in this cold, dark cellar. I tried to calm myself, breathing slowly. The diary was still in my hand. I read again, trying to find a clue, a way out. The writings hinted at someone kept down here for years forgotten. I checked the walls again, running my fingers over the carvings, trying to understand what they meant. Nothing made sense except the feeling of dread that clung to the place like a shadow. I looked around for anything useful, a window, a loose stone, a tool, but found nothing. The cellar was a trap, designed to hold something inside. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. I lost track. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin above and my own breathing. I felt the weight of isolation crushing down on me, the same way I imagined the previous occupant must have felt locked away. The air grew colder still, and my hand shook. Then faintly, I heard the same noises I had heard before, footsteps, muffled voices. But this time, they weren't coming from outside. They seemed to come from the walls, from the shadows themselves. My skin prickled. I pressed myself against the stone, heart racing, telling myself it was just the wind moving through cracks. I tried to focus on my breathing, trying to stay calm. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the creak of the stairs above. The door rattled slightly. Someone was outside. I shouted, pounding on the door with everything I had. After several minutes, the lock finally clicked and the door swung open. I stumbled out, gasping for air, the fresh night breeze hitting my face like a blessing. The cabin felt strange now, unfamiliar and cold. I locked the basement door tight behind me and sat on the floor, hands shaking. I packed up my things quickly the next morning, my hands still trembling, and left the cabin without looking back. I never went back to finish my book there. The memory of the cellar, the diary, and the locked door stayed with me, reminding me that some places hold secrets better left unopened. The silence I once craved became a nightmare, and the cabin, once a refuge, was nothing more than a prison waiting to trap the next curious soul. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, my boots crunching on the dry leaves that littered the narrow trail. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, a scent I hadn't breathed in months. It was the kind of quiet that wraps around you, thick and heavy, making you notice every little sound. This was what I wanted: no city noise, no people, just me and the forest for a whole week. The cabin was old, but sturdy. Weathered wood planks made up the walls, some darkened by years of rain and sun. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, but nothing looked dangerous. It stood on a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that stretched to the sky like silent guards. The sun was dipping low, sending long shadows across the clearing. I set my pack down by the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of dust, wood, and something faintly sour, like stale air that had been trapped for years. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There was a small table, a couple of wooden chairs, and a rusty wood stove in the corner. A narrow bed with a thin mattress sat against one wall. I dropped my pack and went straight to the kitchen counter, where a few empty jars and some old cooking pots rested. I was tired from the hike, but before I could settle in, I wanted to look around. The cabin had one small room and an even smaller loft I planned to sleep in. I moved through the space slowly, running my hand over the rough wood walls. I found a small drawer in the table and opened it. Inside, under some old receipts and a handful of faded photographs, was a piece of paper folded several times. Curious, I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was an old map, yellowed with age and torn at the edges. The lines were faint, but still clear enough to follow. What caught my eye first were the strange symbols marked in red ink all over the map. Some looked like circles with dots inside, others like jagged lines or strange spirals. Then, near the bottom corner, there was a bright red sticker that said, "You are here," but the sticker was stuck far away from where the cabin actually sat. The map's "You are here" was deep in the forest, miles away from the cabin's location. I sat back, staring at the map in silence. It didn't make sense. Why would someone put a sticker that far off? Was it a mistake? Or was the cabin supposed to be somewhere else? I traced the strange symbols with my finger, wondering what they could mean. My eyes caught the faint handwriting near one of the symbols, a note that said "danger" in shaky script. The sun had nearly set when I put the map away. I lit a small fire in the stove, grateful for the warmth as the temperature dropped fast in the woods. The cabin was settling, the wood groaning softly as the night closed in. Outside, the forest was dark and quiet. I felt a brief wave of loneliness settle in, but I pushed it aside. I had wanted this, to be alone, to get away from everything. Just before I fell asleep, I thought I heard something outside. Footsteps, light but deliberate, moving around the cabin's perimeter. I froze, listening hard. The steps stopped suddenly, then silence. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, or a raccoon. I tried to tell myself that, but my heart was beating faster than before. The next day, I woke early. The sun was barely peeking over the trees when I made breakfast on the small stove. The cabin felt colder than the night before, like the air itself was watching. I decided to follow the map's path. If the "You are here" sticker was somewhere else, maybe the map would lead me to something interesting, or at least explain the strange markings. I packed some water, the journal I had found under the cabin's floorboards during my first exploration, and the map. The trail was faint, barely a line between the trees, but I found it after some searching. The forest was dense, with tall trees casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The air smelled of moss and old leaves, and my footsteps stirred small clouds of dust and dirt. After an hour of walking, the trail led me to a clearing. There was an old campsite here, long abandoned. The fire pit was cold and filled with ash, surrounded by broken branches and flattened grass. I saw pieces of an old tent frame, twisted and rusted. Scattered nearby were bits of trash, a cracked metal cup, and a worn backpack half buried in the dirt. I sat down carefully, pulling out the journal I'd found in the cabin, hoping it might tell me more about this place. The cover was leather, soft and worn, the pages yellowed and fragile. The handwriting inside was neat but hurried. It was the journal of a hiker who had gone missing decades ago. The entry started out like a normal trip log, talking about the beauty of the woods, the animals seen along the trail, the peaceful solitude. But as I read further, the tone changed. The writer described strange things, footsteps heard at night, glimpses of shadows moving just beyond sight, the feeling of being watched. The entries grew more frantic, more desperate. The last page was torn and stained, the words almost illegible. I don't know what's out here. It's not animals. Something else moves in the dark. I hear it breathing, footsteps following. I can't trust what I see. The shadows, they lie. Don't trust what you see in the dark. I closed the journal, a cold chill running through me. The woods around the clearing felt suddenly alive, heavy and watching. I stood and looked around, feeling eyes on my back. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking softly. I turned to leave, my pace quickening. That night, back in the cabin, the footsteps returned. They circled the cabin slowly, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving fast. I saw shadows flicker between the trees outside the window, dark shapes slipping between trunks like smoke. I wanted to tell myself it was just my imagination, the old cabin settling, animals moving around. But the footsteps didn't sound like animals. They were too deliberate, too slow. I kept the doors locked, the windows closed tight. I sat by the stove, clutching the journal and staring into the fire. The shadows outside pressed closer, almost as if the dark itself was breathing against the cabin's walls. On the third day, I decided to follow the map again, this time staying alert to anything unusual. The trail from the "You Are Here" mark wound deeper into the forest, crossing over streams and rocky patches. The symbols on the map matched certain landmarks. The circle with the dot appeared near a twisted old tree, the spiral near a cluster of moss-covered rocks. As I moved through the forest, I kept thinking about the journal's last warning. Don't trust what you see in the dark. It echoed in my mind like a mantra. What could it mean? Was the darkness hiding something? Or was it making the mind trick itself into fear? The path ended near a small hill covered in thick bushes and fallen logs. At the top, I found a shallow pit, partly covered with leaves. Inside were more pieces of that old campsite, scraps of fabric, a rusty canteen, and a crumpled paper I picked up carefully. It was another page from the journal, left behind or lost long ago. The handwriting was shaky, words rushed, and almost illegible. They watch, not from far, but close. I see them in the corners of my eyes. When I turn, there's nothing. But they are there, watching, waiting. I don't know what they want. I'm not sure if I'm still safe. The dark hides everything. The forest grew colder, the wind picking up and making the leaves whisper like voices. I felt the weight of the woods pressing in on me. It was time to go back. Back at the cabin, I tried to settle in, but the night was worse. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The shadows didn't just flicker. They moved with purpose, shifting shapes that made me doubt my own eyes. Once I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, but when I blinked, it was gone. Sleep was impossible. I kept the stove burning low, listening to every creak and snap outside. The journal's words haunted me. Don't trust what you see in the dark. On the fourth day, I decided to pack up and leave early. I couldn't stay here anymore, not with the feeling that something was watching, waiting just beyond the edges of sight. As I gathered my things, I studied the map one last time. The strange symbols suddenly made more sense. They marked places where the previous hiker had noticed strange things, places where the forest seemed different, thicker, darker. The "You Are Here" sticker wasn't marking the cabin because the cabin was never meant to be the center of the story. It was just a place away in. The real danger was out there, in the woods themselves, in the shadows and silence. I left the cabin that morning, the sky gray and heavy with clouds. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I walked fast, never stopping, feeling eyes on me with every step. I never found out what exactly was out there in the dark, but I understood one thing clearly. The forest hides more than trees and animals. It hides the unknown, the things we can't see or understand, waiting for us to notice or to make a mistake. And sometimes, the darkness plays tricks on your mind. It shows you things that aren't real or hides things that are. The only way to stay safe was to keep moving, to keep away from the places marked on that old